Mafia III is one of the richest and most rewarding games I've ever played. It's a game that I originally bounced off of, and hard, way back when it first came out in 2016. Much like a relationship doomed to fail due to youth and immaturity, I just wasn't well prepared for it. I wasn't educated enough, wasn't patient enough. I wasn't aware of just how much the game was speaking to me personally, someone born over 2 decades after when its story is set. It's a game that I've long thought about in depth and often for almost half a decade. A game that, despite its setting, becomes increasingly more relevant with each year that passes, years that seem to echo the American past more and more loudly, in the most terrible of ways. It's a game that I have to admit that I deeply love, and that's not something I expected. Of all the games I've played, of all the points of interest I explored, of the extra lives I've lived, Mafia III's New Bordeaux and the time I spent with and as Lincoln Clay are some of the most memorable and precious to me that I've yet spent in the medium. Mafia 3 isn't just some paint-by-numbers journey that the map can imply, and is instead a deeply impactful experience that I've long struggled putting into words. It's taken me literal years to pare down my thoughts and feelings into something coherent enough to convey via words, and even so, I'm not sure getting these words out of my head and into the world will exercise this feeling, this frustration of inadequately explaining it out of me. Even at the end, when I click save on the file for this script, after I've recorded my voice and I've clicked publish on this video and moved on to the next project, I'm still not sure if I'll convey just how important Mafia 3 is. But I hope to. Unlike its predecessors, Mafia 3 isn't the years-long journey that Mafia players were used to. Instead, protagonist Lincoln Clay's story takes place over just a few months, from February to October of 1968. Foregoing the generational narratives players became used to before in many ways was an unpopular decision, I believe, due to the fondness of players in seeing how Mafia's Tommy Angelo and Mafia II's Vito Scaletta grew as people and as criminals over their years involved in illicit enterprise. Foregoing these extended narratives does a great deal for Lincoln and the player, because compacting the story into just a few short months helps convey the force of vengeance and of righteousness that not just one man, but an entire focused and empowered community can become. In this way, Mafia 3 serves as a powerful message for those who may feel powerless during uncertain times. 1968 was a turbulent year for the United States of America and, in many ways, the world. From the ongoing tumult of the Vietnam War through the closing years of the American Civil Rights Movement, the United States of America underwent many years of political and societal instability that modern Americans may find oddly familiar. In short, there is a war at home, a war of justice, of black and white, of the powerful and the powerless, with weapons of voices, posters, and song wielded just as often as guns, tear gas, dogs, and police batons. As the United States grappled with both his legacies of deeply rooted political and economic white supremacy, it also tried to meet its societal desire to move forward into a new era of prosperity and harmony with other peoples of the world after decades of needless war, strife, and bloodshed via World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and Vietnam. Despite this desire to heal from the scars of the past and move on with a well-lived and peaceful life, at least one of those American stories would continue to unfold into both a rapturous violence and a precisely guided fury. A silent rage that would start with a single bullet that would progress to completely tear apart and then rebuild the illicit infrastructure of an entire city. The story of Lincoln Clay and his lieutenants, a dark, deadly whisper of a woman scorned, a grieving but dutiful Irishman, and a washed-up Italian mobster turned mob chaperone is no doubt a longer, more complex one than what we get to see. While not true to our history, the stories of Mafia 3 serve as an echo from another time, a world that could have existed and does here, in the form of a story that exists as an example of what could be. Their place in the world, within one of the many geographical and political flashpoints of American history presented in Hangar 13's faux New Orleans, and one of the bloodiest and most subversive moments in fictional American history, would result in the rise of the Clay crime family and the coup of New Bordeaux. Our introduction to Lincoln Clay is much like our initial meeting in Mafia II, a parallel I appreciated. While waiting for his adopted brother Ellis to pick him up, much like Joe Barbaro did for Vito in the second game, a Marine and veteran of the Pacific Campaign, a white man, sees Lincoln, and recognizes him. He sees what he is, what he's become, and what he's been through. He sees him as a little brother of sorts, a fellow soldier, a fellow man, a true equal that only someone who's lived that reality could recognize. While Hangar 13 could have gone with a heavy-handed racist right off the bat intro, I greatly appreciated the fact that they didn't, and this was my first clue that Mafia III would take its inspiration seriously and present them with a more even-handed, less dramatic, and more highly skilled hand than lesser writers would. This was a very good sign. Lincoln's is a welcoming homecoming, with smiling faces and drinks to go around. It's important in the way of show don't tell. Lincoln is a celebrated son of the Bayou and the people of the Hollow. He was missed, he's loved, he's celebrated, he's toasted in the social and economic heart of the community. While this story thread is underdeveloped, in my opinion, throughout the rest of the game, I feel that Sammy should have had more of an impact, more young boys and men of the Hollow under his service, but it hits here. It's also a lie, of course, this happy homecoming, because we know everything will fall apart soon, because that's the game that we paid our money for. But I tried to enjoy these happy moments nonetheless. I don't usually like it when designers and writers do this. They create likable characters and kill them pretty much immediately. I dislike when enticing characters are killed off as a function of narrative, but Hangar 13 did a great job of making me want to know much more about these characters before they did so. The next day, Lincoln settles into his return home by serving his community. I really enjoyed the admittedly short-lived experience of working behind the ladle of a soup kitchen, as it shows that Lincoln truly seems to have a servant's heart, which is surely due to the influence of mentor Father James's influence on him. This doesn't last long, however, as the Haitian mob crashes the party. The highly trained water veteran cracks their skulls in short order and resolves to solve the encroachment impersonally, despite his adopted father's worries. The Haitian mob isn't just an internal threat to the Hollow's residents either, as they're also an existential threat to Sammy's operations and his seat at Sal Marcano's table. Their interference and robberies have caused Sammy to become unable to kick up his required percentages to Marcano, the head of New Bordeaux's criminal empire. Despite Ellis's desire to wipe out the Haitians in the Hollow, the advice Sammy gives Lincoln to avoid bloodshed inside the Hollow's neighborhood so as to avoid the widespread impression of black folks killing each other is sound advice, so much so that it informed my gameplay for the entire first chapter of the game in Del Rey Hollow. The advice is wise, and it's considerate of people, something many leaders aren't, and it lends a lot of support to legitimize Sammy's rule over the area. That night, Lincoln uses his war-fighting skills to almost completely wipe out the Haitian gang and destroy their operations, and in doing so also frees a young woman from captivity. It's a powerful and well-acted moment that is just one of many to come in this game. Shortcomings aside, the motion capture and acting from the main characters in this game are consistently excellent, at least in the game's pre-rendered cutscenes. Character interactions are much more wooden in the in-game world where they happen, but I also understand that Hangar 13 wasn't working with a Grand Theft Auto budget here, so I let that slide in favor of enjoying the game for what it is rather than what I wish it would be. The very next morning, Lincoln meets with Georgie and Sal Marcano to be recruited for the Federal Reserve heist. This is our first meeting with who will become our central antagonists, and Sal and Georgie Marcano are likable as hell. Not just likable, they're powerfully and convincingly complex and human in ways that most villains are mustache-twirling cliches. The heist isn't all, though, as the elder Marcano is so impressed with Lincoln's initiative in securing the Hollow's interests, he offers to help Sammy retire and have Lincoln run the Hollow on Marcano's behalf. Once again, we see Lincoln's humility and service-minded outlook as he declines Marcano's offer. The next day, Lincoln, Ellis, and Georgie meet Irish mobsters Thomas and Danny Burke to finalize plans for the heist, which brings us to one of my favorite early scenes in the game. It's less than 3 minutes long, but this one scene is so well written and naturally animated that gave me the impression that these young men, these princes of the city's most competent criminals, were brothers in a way. Young men who had grown up together and had long known each other. They laugh, they drink, they joke, and all in the comfort of familiarity that seems long held by each of them. I felt, based on this scene, a sincere warmth and respect from each of them for the others. It's what makes what's to come so shocking and so regrettable. Ellis, Lincoln's adopted brother, receives the least development of the four, but it's clear that he looks up to Lincoln without malice or envy, and he's proud of his big brother. His interactions with Sammy also suggest that he respects his father and his guidance. While Ellis is a bit of a hothead, he's not without sense and restraint, and he listens to the advice of those he respects. Danny, the son of Thomas Burke, also relieves little screen time due to what's to come, but he seems to be a good-natured and loyal friend and is well loved by his sister Nikki, who adores him despite his mischief, surely in part due to his unconditional acceptance of her in a world that largely discriminates against her for reasons we'll learn later. Georgie, the son of New Bordeaux kingpin Sal Marcano, is someone Lincoln will spend a bit more time with, and Georgie was the most fascinating and likable of the three for me. While he ultimately is the one to betray Lincoln via literal bullet to the head, I didn't hate him. Georgie seems to be one of the most progressive in his interactions with Lincoln and viewpoints toward black people compared to the rest of Marcano's, including his father. While there are many other antagonists in the game are reductive and even venomous towards Lincoln, Georgie seems to have a genuine and healthy respect for his friend. In the heist that follows, he even prepares Lincoln for the possibility that he may join in the white police officer's slurs to minimize suspicion and asks Lincoln not to take it personally. While the opportunity certainly presents itself for him to be cruel and disparage Lincoln in front of the guards, he never does, or at least I couldn't find any in my footage, and he remains respectful of the man. What ties these men together most closely, besides their boyhood bonds, is that each of them greatly looks up to their father figure and wants to make each man proud. In Ellis and Lincoln's case, it's simply doing right by the man who's provided for them, opportunity or otherwise. In Danny's, he wants to have a good time alongside his father and provide the support his sister needs. And in Georgie's, he wants to do whatever his father asks, both to secure his own legacy, but also to maintain his father's, even in ways the elder Marcano desperately wants him to abandon. While each of them display and act upon their loves for these men differently, each son is alike in the fact that each of them are utterly loyal to the man who raised them, even to a fault. This one scene remains one of the most bittersweet in the game for me because it points to a future that just cannot be. As much as I'd like to see these men spend more time together, whether in innocence like this or in the pursuits of criminality, Danny and Ellis will never live a life beyond the next 24 hours, and the brotherly bond that Lincoln and Georgie share will be shattered and reforged even stronger within the fires of revenge. While Mafia III is very much a singularly focused story, it's also an entire volume of shattered families, of ruined brotherhood, and lost opportunities. Mafia III is in many ways a tragic volume of storytelling. On February 27th, 1968, Lincoln and Georgie gear up in police uniforms. The heist starts off strong with an ethical question that right off the bat provides an opportunity to the player the choice of what kind of criminal Lincoln Clay will be. In my case, I try to play most competent criminals as fair but ruthless when it comes to loose ends, threats, and or witnesses who could later expose us for our criminal wrongdoings. I demonstrated a similar disposition in the first Mafia game, as I chose to execute the bank manager from that game's bank heist, since he put me and my friend's life in danger. Another example of this going the other way, of getting caught and suffering the consequences of criminal wrongdoing, is Mafia II's Vito Scaletta being imprisoned for years due to his being reported on by witnesses. I chose for Lincoln the same mindset, although in this case I didn't realize the execution would be this dramatic, and I kind of wish that I just shot the poor bastard outside this grisly animation. After he's crossed out, I throw him into the alligator pond just outside, partly because it's satisfying, but also because I always look at the achievements of games in anticipation for what's to come, and I appreciated the devs accounting for players who wanted to feed gators with people. After a short, somewhat stunning drive into the city to its total reserve, the heist goes awry and Georgie and Lincoln are forced to hold out until Ellis and Danny take their places underneath the vault. It's a pretty normal and expected gunfight, not dissimilar to Grand Theft Auto V's opening heist, albeit less sharp and more brutal in a less polished way. Once they make their way out, four mobsters make their way through a pseudo-stealth portion of the game where they have to make their way through a Mardi Gras celebration. It's a sequence that reminded me of the Mardi Gras parade in A Murder of Crows, a level in Hitman Blood Money, a game released about a decade earlier. Danny, who's been gravely injured, is disguised as a drunkard and rests on Lincoln's shoulder in what reinforces Lincoln as a mountain of a man. Lincoln once again shows a service mentality and unit first mindset, and it's clear that his training has made him the most competent and disciplined of the group, something that will be a constant throughout the game. As they need to split up to evade the police, Lincoln makes his way through police patrols as a distraction before regrouping with the rest of the crew. It's a fun sequence that helps differentiate the game from its predecessors, as the previous Mafia games had very little competent stealth gameplay. With the heist complete and the escape successful for everyone involved, the betrayal of Lincoln Clay, the killing of Danny Burke, of Ellis and Sammy Robinson, and the burning down of Sammy's place weren't unexpected to me. All these events were clearly advertised in nearly every trailer that Mafia III used in its marketing campaign, and yet despite knowing almost every step of what would come, I was still deeply disturbed by it. It's not the brutality of the killings that got me, not really, as I've committed much more heinous virtual acts myself, but because of the rapid shift from familiarity and intimacy to brutal violence so quickly. As I've said already, Sal and Georgie were deeply likable characters to me, and Lincoln is deeply respected and feared by each of them. The finality of the severing of these bonds was the true trauma inflicted, and the true atrocity committed here. Many films use this technique of building tension slowly over time before letting it explode in a brutal climax of action, some of the most notable being in films like Pulp Fiction, Inglourious Basterds, and Sicario, all personal favorites of mine. It's a technique that's commonly used in film, much less commonly pulled off in the medium of video games. I was glad to see this technique used in such an effective and mature fashion. A piece of important information about the double cross isn't included in the game and instead has to be found in one of the game's trailers. Georgie had no idea that he'd be tasked with helping to kill these men until after he escaped from the heist and met with his father. This was kind of a shock to me, as I thought Georgie had known since Lincoln had turned down his offer as father of leadership. Instead, the elder Marcano let Georgie in on the deal right before they headed to the bar for their cut. This moment is so important and in many ways as impactful for Georgie as well as Lincoln, because it serves as a way to both earn his father's approval and show that he could succeed his father and take over their criminal enterprise when the time comes. I respect that Sal insisted Georgie engage in this violence themselves, as many villains would dispatch their cronies to do so, much like happened to Tommy and Don Salieri in Mafia I. Instead, Sal's personal involvement in this endeavor helped me better understand why he was the head of this crime family in the first place. The massacre at Sammy's bar transpired on the night of February 27, 1968, and to the game's credit, Lincoln's recovery isn't instant like so many open-world checkpoint resets or hospital visits like Grand Theft Auto. Much like Mafia II's prison sequence, Metal Gear Solid Phantom Liberty, or the newer Wolfenstein games, for 4 long turbulent months, Lincoln Clay would lie in convalescence in the care of his sole remaining father figure, the local priest, Father James Ballard. While Lincoln would wake up in early June, the country would face a series of events that would rock the nation, events that would directly affect New Bordeaux and the larger American society in ways that were unpredictable for the American people, and in some ways, these events directly affect Lincoln Clay's campaign across the city. Just a day later, after the killings at Sammy's bar, the massively influential American news reporter Walter Cronkite announced his disdain for the Vietnam War effort during his regularly scheduled nightly news broadcast, which affected public opinion so drastically that President Johnson would just 1 month later announce that he would not seek another term of office. The next morning, Sal and Georgie Marcano award governance of Del Rey Hollow to Richie Doucette, the redneck tough who personally killed Lincoln's brother Ellis, leader of the Dixie Mafia, the game's fictionalized version of the real-life criminal organization of the same name. These Dixie Dicks take no time at all to enact Georgie's plan to profit from heroin by distributing it freely to the Hollow's black community, thereby oppressing and subduing them with a single stroke of addiction. Just a month after Cronkite's broadcast and Lincoln came under the care of Father James, pastor and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee on April 3rd. Contrary to popular belief, Dr. King was in Memphis not for a black-centered civil rights event, but to support the Memphis sanitation workers' labor strike, an event that had less to do with advocating for black rights specifically and was much more focusing on addressing the exploitation of common laborers, no matter their ethnic background. This kind of advocacy and coalition building of dissimilar peoples was one of the major reasons Dr. King's organizational efforts were so successful, and a similar mechanism for change takes place within Mafia III under Lincoln Clay's leadership. The very next day, on April 4th, just after 6 p.m. in the evening, Dr. King was shot dead at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Because of the assassination, riots erupted in major American cities, lasting for several days and weeks thereafter. It's against this historical backdrop that Father James makes his decision, one that, according to the documentary the game is framed around, will haunt him for the rest of his days, as he calls CIA officer John Donovan, Lincoln's handler in Vietnam, to aid in Lincoln's recovery. Father James explains his decision later as a lapse in judgment, as his anger, hurt, and frustration at Dr. King's assassination had in part informed his brash decision-making, and the game makes clear that Father James' intervention is what sets Lincoln on his bloody path, as Donovan serves as the pivotal asset that allows Lincoln to take his revenge. And Donovan, eager as hell to continue his shadowy work, wastes no time at all to collect information on the Marcano family and their criminal enterprises across the city, as more events unfold across the nation as Lincoln recuperates. On April 11th, just 1 week after Dr. King's assassination, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. A document long overdue as the United States slowly and painfully moved forward into a more just nation, one that still, to this day, still struggles with the legacies of ethnic and economic inequality. In May, Perla's Theater, local fixture of the community owned by Sammy and formerly run by his Waitlife Perla, is converted by the Dixie Mob into a forced brothel and is renamed Doucette's. Inside, local black women are forcibly addicted to heroin and kept in sexual servitude to an exclusively white clientele, with the combined threats of withdrawal and homelessness compelling them to stay day in and day out. It's a ghoulish venture, and one that doubly serves as an insult to the injury done to the Hala, and as a daily message that white supremacy as the way of the world is alive and well, and that black bodies are fully at the will and whims of their so-called white betters. We're not told the precise day Lincoln awakens, but we see he does so just in time to see another assassination of a prominent, well-loved American, this time in California. Presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy, brother of former President John F. Kennedy, who was himself assassinated by a former United States Marine 5 years before during a parade in Texas. As presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy advocated on behalf of the civil rights movement and in favor of the Civil Rights Act being passed. He had also given a speech in remembrance of Dr. King upon that man's killing, urging all Americans to come together in unity against racism and needless hate. While these two men were largely seen as somewhat radical figures at the time due to their opposition to the status quo, it's possible that had they lived, the goals of equality and anti-racism would have been far more successful with such impactful and impassioned men at the forefront of these causes. It's a thought that's not easily lost on me as I write this under the administration of oligarchs and fools, one of whom delivered a Nazi salute at the president's inauguration, and another who's the very son of the Robert F. Kennedy I'm speaking of here. And even more recently, federal troops have been mobilized in various states across the United States, primarily due to protests against the federal police force. In Mafia III, these events, these crises, are the backdrop of Sal Marcano's betrayal of various crime bosses in New Bordeaux, but within lie the fruit that the seeds of racism and inequality allowed to flourish so strongly. Without the promises of legal protections and societal equality that civil rights advocates so strongly fought for, Marcano committed these murders in part simply because he's allowed to, both by the nation but also by the white politicians and white policemen in the city. By not protecting the black community as a persistent and responsibly held policy, local leaders and law enforcement leave these communities open to being preyed upon those with the wills to do so, without legal consequence or fear of reprisal. It's exactly the kind of situation that lends itself to a person or community taking the responsibilities of justice and protecting their communities into their own hands, which is also how many street gangs began in our real-life United States. While he may not have personally intervened in the larger system of inequality of New Bordeaux had Georgie Marcano not skipped that bullet across his forehead, Lincoln's campaign across the city is a natural, if exaggerated, consequence of societal inequality of this magnitude. When Lincoln wakes up and is able to walk in early June, he wastes no time in taking the next steps to hold Sal Marcano accountable for killing his family. Father James tries to preach temperance, allowing that Lincoln kill Marcano and nothing more, but Lincoln's CIA-sponsored training to dismantle and dismay is a stronger guide than his childhood lessons from the orphanage. This scene is the first of several that features James and Donovan as the two biggest influences on Lincoln and their arguments and values. It's also the first scene in which I started taking a side as well. I agree with Lincoln in this moment, as I also believe that those who perpetuate harm upon others should be held accountable for their actions, rather than to forgive and forget them and let them continue to deliver those and even more advanced injustices on the world. In my experience, I've found that if you allow assholes to be assholes, even in small cases, often they'll go on to be bigger ones in time. Lincoln's first stop is back where his world was shattered, at Sammy's bar. As he walks through the ruins, a hallucinatory bout of PTSD shows him who and what he's lost yet again: his brother, his friend, his father, and his community, along with those who took it from him: Sal Marcano and his son Georgie, and Lincoln's first target, the man who stabbed his little brother Ellis to death, Richie Doucette, the Marcano lieutenant assigned to Lincoln's home, Delray Hala. Outside of the bayou surrounding the city, Delray Hala is the poorest and least invested district of the city, and by design, as it's the primary residential area of New Bordeaux's black community. Sammy ran the Hala with some grace and dignity alongside his wife Perla, and together they ran Sammy's bar and Perla's nightclub. His primary illicit income came in the form of the Black Lottery, a gambling operation in which the black community was often lightly coerced into participating. In short, bets were made on a variety of topics, including sports games, stock market, incidental community events, and more. While we don't have specifics, my best guess is that the winner would receive a portion of the overall pool, and the rest would go to Sammy's operation. A cut of all of those winnings would then go to Sal Marcano. During the intro of the game, we learned that Sammy had been behind on delivering the Marcano cut of the lottery due to the Haitian attacks on Sammy's mob. This is one of the reasons Sammy was so eager to get in on the heist, as his position at the table was being undermined and was at risk. Unbeknownst to him, this is why Marcano was so eager to enlist Lincoln as his personal lieutenant and Sammy's replacement. In his defense, Sammy wasn't a fool, though, and his insistence on taking care of the people of the Hollow wasn't a falsehood or a misdirection. He actually does care about the community and does try to give back in his own way, as the food bank Clay worked at during the prologue is one of Sammy's contributions back to the community from their own lottery. He also thought of himself as an independent black entrepreneur, as he bought and ran both Sammy's and continued to run Perla's in his wife's honor, and it seems part of why he tried to be so level-headed and professional was to set a good example for the rest of the black community, especially younger generations. Sammy seemed less like a brutal crime lord and more of an opportunist who played the game well up until he felt he reached his most reasonable ceiling. He didn't seek power, influence, or money in the ways most crime bosses seem to, and I have a lot of respect for this presentation of a career criminal in this way. When Lincoln awakens and returns to the Hala, he finds it a shell of its former self, as Georgie has authorized the Dixie Mafia to run heroin throughout the area. To add to the enterprise, they've added cake to Crystal by enlisting local black women as strippers, dancers, and sex workers, many who act as the go-between from their dealers and to their clients. While some of this is coerced, the way some of the women talk, it seems as this is their best bet to make money and take care of themselves and their families. From here, Lincoln's task is to find the leader of the Haitian gang, as they're the only black influence fighting back against the Dixie Mafia's activities. He does so, only to learn it's the woman he saved from the Haitians before, a woman by the name of Cassandra. At least, that's the name we're given for her. There's enough ambiguity in the game to suggest that's not her real name, as she seems to use many aliases, and it's never clear which of them is her legal identity. We'll later come to learn more about her, but for now, she wants the Hala liberated from the Dixie Mafia. Mechanically speaking, throughout the game, Lincoln is tasked with disrupting criminal rackets ran by the Marcano's criminal operations in each district. Each racket has multiple points of attack in which the players can engage with. Destroying these draws out the Marcano subordinates that Lincoln needs to take down in order to further weaken the organization. All of this is made possible by Jeffrey Donovan's intelligent support in the background. There's a scene in this first chapter in which he shows Lincoln how to tap into local comms junction boxes using electronic scraps Lincoln collect throughout the city. Mechanically, this allows the player to see enemies on the minimap and through walls of the district in which all junction boxes are tapped. It also allows Lincoln to listen in on some communications between the Marcanos as he pursues control of their rackets. In the Hulla, these two rackets are prostitution and heroin. While the cities of Mafia I and Mafia II were almost exclusively non-reactive, Mafia III does a great deal to reflect the impact the player and Lincoln have had on the city of New Bordeaux as the city progresses. In each district, as the Clay crime family takes over the rackets and absorbs them into his own operations, the area changes to reflect the new changes in management. There are few places in the game in which the changes are as personal as they are in Del Rey Hulla. Within the Hulla, a few blocks down away from the ruins of Sammy's Bar sits a building in a similar situation. The Del Rey First Baptist Church was firebombed a half-decade before, and despite Sammy's best efforts, the impoverished area couldn't quite come up with the funds to renovate the building. The Dixie Mafia, for their part, have reclaimed the church as the distribution hub for their heroin operation, and their primary laborers are black women who are required to work mostly nude. I found it quite ironic that an institution long used to extol the virtues of slavery to the black community was then reclaimed and repurposed by those oppressed people to serve their spiritual needs, only for that creation to be destroyed once it was found to be a place of solace and strength. These white supremacists just will not leave this poor community alone. Once Lincoln clears out the Church of the Squatters, the player is presented with the first of many opportunities to either recruit or kill the racket's existing boss. In this case, the specialist is presumably an expert in smuggling and managing supply chains, but mechanically the choice is either between a one-time upfront cash reward or a permanent recurring bonus to the racket's operation. I loved this system, as it allowed me to roleplay and make decisions on the fates of the individuals who ran these operations. As I wanted this individual's expertise and his productivity bonus, I recruited him. That choice isn't always for the player, however, as there are some offenses that Lincoln simply cannot allow to go unpunished. A few blocks away, Sammy's late wife's livelihood, Pearlie's nightclub, is being converted into Doucette's, a white trash brothel operation that subjugates local black women as heroin-addicted sex workers. While the player can choose how to clear out the building, the decision of how the rackets take over ends is exclusively Lincoln's, and he kills the man. Whether the player or Lincoln decides their fate, once the boss is dealt with, Lincoln will call an underboss to send a crew to secure and take ownership of the racket. After this scene, the player can then explore the area to see what changes his new management has implemented. While the details don't change according to which underboss or crew gets ownership of the racket, in most changes the change is actually for the better and can be considered more pro-social and community-oriented compared to the situation before. For the Hulla, the heroin distribution hub is reverted back to a usable community church that also serves as the main distribution hub of Lazar's marijuana operation. Pearlie's nightclub is renovated and reopened as the elegant cultural social gathering space it always was. The more I progressed throughout the game, the more it dawned on me that overall, the Clay crime family is very much a community-minded organization, a hypothesis supported later on in the game. While Cassandra and Clay's goals are obviously to profit from selling marijuana, they're also using these funds to fund Sammy's community kitchen, renovate the church, and buy firearms to arm the Hulla citizens, thereby protecting them from future Dixie or Marcano incursions. It struck me just how ahead of its time this operation is, as it also allows the community to partake of the marijuana itself, thereby decreasing violence and providing a medical alternative to meet certain needs that would otherwise go completely untreated. In the case of Pearlie's, the Clay crime family is offering a stable and safe environment, providing employment, entertainment, and fellowship for workers, performers, and patrons alike. This is just one of the many cases in which I don't believe Mafia III got the full credit it deserved by its audience upon release. There was a great deal of thought, care, and detail put into Mafia III's world in ways that the first two games never even attempted. Once the rackets are cleared and or taken over, Lincoln then changes his focus to the leader of the district. While Mafia III can be accused of using a repetitive system of racketeering, these bosses are much more similar to the narrative introduced with that heist at the beginning of that game. Each of them provides a much more closely directed and impactful experience and does a great deal to provide context and character to each villain as Megan works his way up the ranks. In the Hollis case, the leader is a cruel coward of a man by the name of Richie Doucette. In the southwest of Del Rey Holla, there lies the remains of a failed segregated theme park, purpose-built by local white money to appease the black community and keep them, quite literally, in their place. While on its face it may sound like a public works project designed to invest in the local black population, Baron Saturday's Fun Park instead serves as a kind of huge racist tchotchke. It's a relic from a bygone time in which the racist and feeble-minded depictions of black people were commonplace and socially accepted. There's a widely known but rapidly disappearing depiction of black people that was most often seen in the American South for many decades. Foregoing any subtlety whatsoever, the depiction is most often of a black person with pitch black, not brown or light brown, but pitch black skin, big white teeth, and plump red lips, usually drawn upward in a smile. There are some variations, of course: crooked teeth, dirty complexion, ill-fitting and or patched clothing, and more, but the basic depiction is one that was meant to delegitimize and infantilize black people in public spaces and in public opinion more broadly. As I grew up in the state of Georgia for a great deal of my life, I'd seen these depictions on multiple occasions, and while they made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't articulate at the time, I later learned that these were a normal and accepted part of Southern culture for many decades, preceding my birth in the late 1900s. The most memorable was a statue of a lawn jockey at the end of my grandparents' driveway, cast in concrete, stood a young black boy in black boots, white pants, and a red vest. His arm was extended, and in the hole drilled into his fist he held a lantern made of metal and glass. Day or night, hot, cold, rain or shine, we drove past him each and every time we came in or out of that driveway. I remember him well, not so much because of his outfit, but because I remember the feeling of commiserating the fact that this small black boy was locked into a kind of servitude at my family's whim. I remember sometimes walking up to him as a very young child and talking to him because I felt bad for him and I didn't want him to be lonely, thanking him for lighting our way. At the time, he was just the boy, but as I saw more and more of similar figures, I realized that what I was seeing were pieces of racist memorabilia that my grandmother had collected. It really cemented for me just how goddamn racist our society was. These fuckers weren't just racist, they were so racist and so smugly satisfied with their so-called superiority that they ran an entire cottage industry of art about how great they are and how inferior other ethnicities are by comparison. More recently, these depictions have rightfully been replaced and removed from public life, some of the more well-known remnants being brands such as Mrs. Butterworth and Aunt Jemima. Outside of commerce and marketing, examples of these depictions remain with private collectors and public history organizations, such as the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Imagery. Before we move on, you may wonder, does that mean my grandmother was racist? I suppose it could be that she wasn't, that her collection was simply a result of an eccentricity or appreciation of the craftsmanship of mass-produced white supremacist whatnots, but no, she was a very racist woman who I love dearly. It's strange how that works, and we'll talk about that much later in the video. Baron Saturday's Fun Park is absolutely packed with this kind of outdated imagery. In Mafia III's case, it stands as an example of the combined insensitivity and audacity of the local white population and insistence on adhering to power structures that to this day are hotly contested. The failure of Baron Saturday's Fun Park was in part a failure of the local white powers that be in New Bordeaux to recognize the basic humanity of their black neighbors, and in part a furious refusal from the black community to adhere to the racist standards that were so readily acceptable in years past. This was a challenge to be taken seriously and valued instead of patronized and insulted. And in a strange but powerful way, the amusement park stands as a monument to the resolve of the residents of the Hollow in their refusal to accept less than they deserve as fellow human beings who so richly contribute to New Bordeaux's culture. Deeper into the amusement park, there exists a ride of sorts that shows crude depictions of black people not just as crude and foolish, but as man-beasts. Over the intercom system, an audio loop plays throughout the encounter, telling the story of the loup-garou, the French word for werewolf, and it makes these comparisons to black people as a matter of course, uncritically and unashamedly drawing comparisons between them as a matter of casual fact. Lincoln Clay, just like any other black person who could have visited the park, stands right next to these depictions as a stark refutation of them. This is exactly why having establishments like Sammy's Bar and Perle's nightclub in the heart of the black community are so important. Spaces like these exist and endure in any community because they're an accepted and often cherished reflection of that community's values. It's a precise reason why the Honky Park was rejected so strongly. The people of Del Rey Hollow had no part in its creation, nor did it reflect them. In university, I took a variety of courses that focused on American culture depictions via film and video, and in those, one film repeatedly came up in those classes that I still can't forget. In 1915, in one of the legitimately great but unfortunate accomplishments of American art, The Birth of a Nation by director D.W. Griffiths was released. The first epic film, Birth, was a silent film that runs for more than 3 hours, and over the course of my academic career, I've had the distinct displeasure of watching it in full twice. Lincoln Clay stands as a stark contrast to these depictions of black people and black men specifically. In the most relevant scene to this particular comparison, there's a scene in the film in which a black freedman and Union soldier, Gus, pursues a white woman named Flora. He finds her attractive, young, vibrant, innocent, and his goal is to press her into marriage against her will. In the scene, Flora makes her displeasure known and strikes the man and flees from him. Throughout the next few shots of the scene, Flora is depicted as a frightened young woman who's fleeing from a literal monster. Gus is depicted as a wild subhuman with a blatant disregard for the woman's safety as he chases her. His eyes are wild with excitement, and his chase after her can more appropriately be described as an inhuman shamble, more akin to a fast zombie or a werewolf mid-transformation, rather than the gait and pace of a healthy man. I pair the footage of this scene here to show you something exceedingly important. Gus, the so-called black man, isn't even fucking played by a black actor. In another long-standing Southern tradition shown by this shot in a later scene, white men painted themselves in blackface and played these so-called monsters themselves. So many depictions of black actors simply wouldn't be played by them, partly due to self-respect and in part because racist white men wanted to emphasize the monstrous features and characteristics they'd made up about black people, and it seems they felt they just had to take on those roles themselves to sufficiently make their points. The necessity of white men to play these roles further points to the fundamental disconnect between the reality of black people versus the fictionalized monstrosities these men wanted to portray. It's all white supremacist propaganda bullshit. It's a part of the white supremacist fantasy that these men insisted was reality. But even in their own fictions, they had to step into these roles themselves because the reality of how black people live and act simply do not fucking match this racist bullshit they insist on. The handsomeness, the beauty, the basic humanity of black people as they exist would have been too much for them to be taken in as monsters by any reasonable audience, hence the swap. It's kind of amazing, actually, to see just how much American culture has changed in the last century, or how little, depending on their perspective, and to see how Mafia III was even made at all, considering the American society's complicated history of racism. In 2016, a competent, handsome, heroic black man sets out to avenge his murdered family and dismantle an entire major American city's economic and political systems in pursuit of justice against white supremacists. 100 years later, 1916, for example, such a depiction just simply wasn't possible, not even close. It wasn't even legally allowed. In 1928, a radio show by the name of Amos and Andy was first broadcast in Chicago, Illinois, in which two white men played the title characters and made a great and publicly loved mockery of black people and black culture at large. I cannot help but emphasize that this wasn't a small deal. This radio show played on millions of radios every evening. It was funded by advertisements. During the commercial breaks, they used the show to sell goddamn toothpaste and television sets and Campbell's soup. And it wasn't a fleeting show either. It was syndicated, reran, republished, resumed in different forms for over 30 years until it was finally discontinued in 1960. And that's just the radio version. In 1951, the show was reconceived for television. It's important to note that by this time, public sentiment had turned somewhat against the blackface portrayals from years past, and as Black Americans were allowed to portray themselves more and more, Black actors were cast into the title roles for the first time. Instead of the monsters shown in Birth of a Nation, Amos and Andy were portrayed instead as uneducated buffoons, sometimes dishonest and crooked, but overall harmless, lovable idiots eager to please the American public. The show ran on publicly syndicated channels until 1966, the year before Lincoln returned home to New Bordeaux. I'd watched a few episodes of the show back in university, and while I found the writing to be, in a way, standard sitcom fare, I also found it incredibly demeaning and infantilizing to the American people as a whole and Black people specifically. It was insulting to see just how little curiosity and critical thought was credited to Black people in the forms of intellect and personality. I watched another few episodes of Amos and Andy on YouTube for research for this script, and in the very first episode of the show, Andy meets his friend Kingfish to find that he's suddenly become a doctor. Kingfish, a lovable con man and trickster of sorts, uses his newfound credentials to disrobe Andy and relieve him of his wallet. Throughout the scene, Kingfish's misunderstanding and mispronunciation of basic medical terms and concepts, along with his bad teeth and even poorer bedside manner and diagnostic skills, were played for laughs. It's so funny, right? Look at how cute this poor old colored fellow is. He's got a blood testing kit, a stethoscope, and a lab coat. He's so cute, he thinks he can really be a doctor. Something I should not have been surprised about in the year of our Lord 2025, as idiocy and anti-intellectualism seem to be having their heyday, were just how fucking ignorant the comments were. And please keep in mind, I did not edit these. These are the exact quotes from the YouTube video I'm referencing. Quote, "Quite a refreshing TV series that had blacks being funny, unlike today's TV shows where it's silly humor." End quote. Quote, "When I was a little kid, I watched this show in reruns. There was nothing racist about it. It was just funny." End quote. Quote, "A good show is a good show. Race shouldn't matter." End quote. Quote, "These people really had true talent. Shame the program was canceled when so much garbage runs for many years." End quote. The fact that so many people can watch an episode of this show and take it at face fucking value is astounding to me. How very far we've come in 70 years. How very not far at all. The question may arise, understandably, why did these Black actors participate in this? The answer is complicated. In part, it was an opportunity for a paycheck, yes, but it was also an opportunity for Black people to be a part of the process of putting on these shows, and to become an opportunity to influence those portrayals and to get their foot in the door so that they could have more impactful voices within the medium over time. In some ways, it was an improvement for a Black American man in the 1950s to not be seen as a dangerous predator be lynched on sight, and to instead be seen as a harmless simpleton that one can simply point and laugh at. It's a fine line to walk sometimes too, as 2012's Django Unchained shows us with the character of Stephen, portrayed by contemporary Black actor Samuel L. Jackson. Stephen, the most respected and most influential slave on the plantation, openly challenges the plantation owner about a Black freedman who's been allowed to sleep in the plantation manager. While his mannerisms make him seem feeble and weak, we learn later that it's all an act. Stephen is the true power behind the throne, and his comfortable position being put at risk both terrifies and infuriates him. While he's not monstrous in the same way of those earlier depictions, nor does he ever lay a hand on anyone, he's very much not harmless. He's a very intelligent, charismatic, and calculating man. To the contrary, many of the white slavers in the film are depicted as the idiots, a stark comparison to the heroic Klansmen in Birth of a Nation's earlier depictions of white supremacists. The line to interesting, nuanced, and well-developed Black characters like 2012's Stephen and 2016's Lincoln Clay can gradually but directly be drawn back to characters like Virgil Tibbs and Carl Winslow in the 1990s, back to Fred Sanford and Bill Cosby in the 1970s, all the way back to Amos and Andy in the 1950s. Gradual and sometimes seismic shifts in culture may seem small in real time, but future generations will most assuredly suffer or benefit from them. And how we react to the depictions and narratives of our time will, like then, be instrumental in shaping the world to come. To be fair, Lincoln can certainly be considered a monster of sorts. After all, he is convincingly acting the part of an apex predator as he actively hunts and kills hundreds or even thousands of men, leaving piles of bodies in his wake, and then claims their dens and hideaways for his pack before he turns to new prey. The difference between these earlier portrayals and the reality of the situation is that Lincoln does not engage in violence due to some sort of inherent internal character flaw or shortcoming. He's not a murderous beast who just happens to kill every person he encounters, white or otherwise, and he is not a wild, monstrous figure who eats babies. He kills these men in the pursuit of what he considers a sense of right and wrong, of justice and accountability. The very first step along that road of accountability is on the throat of Richie Doucette. While he denies his involvement and tries to talk his way out of his fate, Lincoln points out that he watched him repeatedly stab his younger brother to death. Lincoln hangs him by the Ferris wheel for the Holla and Dixie Mafia to see, a clownish white flag that also serves as a declaration of intent to the rest of the Marcano organization. Doucette dealt with, Lincoln returns to Cassandra, where she and Lincoln come to an agreement in which Lincoln brings Cassandra and the Haitians under his protection and protects their smuggling operations. In exchange, the Haitian mob are under Lincoln's command and are to provide a cut of all of their income. While Mafia III offers some choices to players in which order they'll take over each city district, I chose to prioritize recruiting each of the underbosses available to Lincoln. In my mind, after liberating Lincoln's home and protecting the black community there, I felt it most appropriate to pay a visit to an old friend, Mafia II protagonist and fan favorite Vito Scaletta. I spoke at length in my Mafia II critique video about how I feel about Vito. Not much has changed since that writing. There's a link below to that video if you'd like to hear it. I'm pleased to say that much of that opinion appears to be validated even years later, as Vito is once again caught with his feet in a pile of shit the size of Sicily. As most Mafia 2 players know, at the end of that game, he was separated from his best friend as the credits rolled. It's revealed here in Mafia 3 that Vito was, in effect, exiled from Empire Bay in a deal arranged by Leo Galante, prominent underboss of Empire Bay. New Bordeaux is where he ended. In the interim, Vito has been tasked with keeping tabs on Sal Marcano and reporting his activities to the families up in Empire. He's not been doing the best job of it. When Lincoln arrives on River Road to recruit Scaletta, he finds the district in a sorry state. This is part of why Vito was granted the district and tasked by Marcano with running it. Outside of the Holla, it's the least developed and least profitable of the city. Besides that, it seems that Vito is simply a poor manager of his people and resources, as the flow doesn't seem to have improved since he's taken over. Two rackets in each district that Lincoln seeks to disrupt and take over are unique to that part of the city. I found that the first usually involves some sort of extraction of value from the locals, and the second involves some sort of production that flows out from the district. In the Holla, the first was black women and the second was heroin. In River Row, the people being exploited are union laborers, and the product is contraband to be imported from and exported to nearby Cuba. Vito's feud is with Marcano's nephew, Michael Greco. We find out that Greco was awarded Lincoln's car from some specified achievement, and that gives us as the player motivation to chase him. But beyond his murder, in which he's rendered fish food, Greco's scenes aren't very memorable beyond serving as a well-worn mafia movie stereotype. Vito's recruitment is a little more than a car chase. Just like with Cassandra, Lincoln makes it clear that Vito works for him now, and he's expecting Vito's kick-up like his old boss did. Vito's indignant, but agrees that he understands, and this is yet another moment in which we see Vito as just competent enough to be useful, but not competent enough to be able to lead his own organization, independent of oversight. With Vito saved and River Row claimed for the Clay crime family, the next stop is Point Verdun, to pay our respects to the father and sister of Danny Burke. At first, I greatly disliked Thomas Burke. He seemed a grumpy old Irish bastard with a terrible haircut and a bad mustache, and he's one of the rudest characters who's just a constant smartass to the protagonist, one of the most abusive and abrasive examples I can remember. Burke is an Irish immigrant who's been running moonshine out of New Bordeaux since he was young, and he's been quite profitable to the Marcanos as a whole. It's only his Irish heritage that doesn't allow him to rise in the ranks. A local Marcano lieutenant, the Butcher Barbieri, was sent to Point Verdun after a barge deal in which Burke lost a large sum of Marcano's money. In retaliation, Barbieri tortured the man by maiming one of his legs, giving Burke his distinctive limp, and took over the district himself. The defense of Burke's garage junkyard is one I found very fun, as Lincoln gets to play roof Korean with a scoped rifle. After a short but furious firefight, Clay comes face to face with Barbieri, in which he takes him out and, much like he does for Vito with Greco, leaves him for Burke to finish off. I found it funny that in the documentary for this bit, the game tells us that Barbieri's body was later found about 20 years later, with the bones of both legs so badly damaged that they were more break than bone. With Barbieri off his feet and Burke back in control of Point Verdun, Lincoln makes the same claim to the district and his cut of it, to which Burke agrees, and the pursuit of the man who killed his son. With Delray Hollow, River Row, and Point Verdun under our control, this brings us to the first so-called sit-down of the Clay crime family's newly appointed leadership. The leaders of the Haitian, Italian, and Irish mobs are initially at each other's throats, all for good, long-standing reasons that predate Lincoln's interference. And revisiting this cutscene, I was reminded at how dominant and ruthless of a man Lincoln is in leading this coalition. While I had personally fantasized about ruling this organization with a calm, just, and compassionate hand, Lincoln does so with an iron fist that he reminds everybody that only he has been effective in improving the local conditions for each of them. With the plan to work their way up the Marcano organization set, Lincoln adjourns the meeting to continue his campaign with Donovan in his ear every step of the way. After the sit-down, if the player hasn't already, they can take the time to assist each of the Clay Crimes family's underbosses and their lieutenants, in which doing so will maximize the efficiency of their rackets and thus Lincoln's investment. Whereas Mafias 1 and 2 did a great job at characterizing the other members of their respective crime families, Mafia 3 does the same, but with such a massive cast of characters, it does so more selectively, choosing to elaborate on just a few. To secure the Haitian operations, Lincoln has to meet and make amends with Cassandra's lieutenant, a Haitian immigrant by the name of Emmanuel Lazare. Lazare, a Verdun priest and widower, lost his wife and children to the brutality of the regime of real-life Haitian dictator François Papadoc Duvalier. While Lazare has proven himself quite adept at smuggling refugees from Haiti to the Americas, this skill ultimately made him a target to the regime, and as they couldn't find him, they targeted his family instead. As of this writing in 2025, there have only been 3 successful violent revolutions that have resulted in a new nation's independence from a previously colonizing nation. The first, the American Revolution, was in 1776 and resulted in the United States of America. The second, the French Revolution, was in 1789 and resulted in the First French Republic. And the third began in 1791 in the Caribbean on the island of Hispaniola, and it resulted in the Empire of Haiti. An admittedly small nation and mislabeled an empire, Haiti has been a largely neglected and mistreated nation since its independence. As I wrote this, I paused to open up the first page of headlines regarding Haiti on the Associated Press website. And the first I saw were of the assassination of Haiti's president 4 years ago, gang violence that has displaced almost 1.5 million Haitian refugees in just the last year, and an article about the Trump administration's efforts to revoke the legal immigration status of over 500,000 of similarly displaced Haitian refugees. These kinds of headlines regarding the nation are not uncommon, as it's been plagued with violence and corruption for many, many years. While the United States and France stabilized and for a time became enduring democracies with strong trade relationships and legal systems that protected their citizens, the nation of Haiti has never enjoyed such a status, and this dates all the way back to that revolution. The reason for this instability is largely due to racism, the very same that we're exploring at large in both this game and Essay. While the US and France were hailed the world over due to the revolutions, the response to Haiti's was much more muted. It's not that the revolution wasn't hard fought or bloodless. Tens of thousands of foreign troops and Haitian combatants and civilians alike were displaced and or killed as a result of that revolution. The reason Haiti hasn't enjoyed the same prosperity as their counterparts is largely due to the failure of international policy to recognize the success of the Haitian people and support the well-meaning, community-minded individuals who sought to positively change the country. Duvalier's jackbooted genocidal rule is but one example of many corrupt and authoritarian leaders who've ruled over the island nation as despots. These men and their policies have historically been the reason so many Haitian people have left the island and sought to find safety and solace in other nations, whether legally or no, and Lazare is a strong example of that tradition. In Cassandra's employ as a criminal, Lazare has proven himself an adept marijuana smuggler for the Haitian group, and as a priest, also serves as her spiritual advisor. Lazare is, in my opinion, an example of a good person compromised by adverse circumstances who was then forced into criminal activities in order to survive. I do not begrudge the man his decisions. When Vito is handed full control of River Row, he appoints as his right hand a young Cuban woman named Alma Diaz. Alma's story isn't far removed from Lazare's, as she was also forced to flee a despotic regime in order to live a safer life. Her father, a clerk for the government in Cuba, was targeted by the Castro regime as a political dissident and murdered in front of his family for this perceived transgression. Alma's mother was apprehended and imprisoned, leaving Alma and her grandmother comparatively unharmed due to the privilege of being underestimated. Alma went on to engage in the anti-Castro movement, but later fled to the United States when the risks became too high to remain. Vito discovered her in a container smuggled from the island nation and took her in and employed her expertise, where she's now responsible for the smuggling operations in and out of the country. Alma is a tough, angry woman, and it's not hard to see why. She, like Lazare, has had to face injustices no one should have to endure, including leaving her home and her family, all she knows, just to survive. In her final discussion with Lincoln, she says that she'd like to save enough money to go back to Havana to discover what happened to her mother. It's not a heroic, I want to save her, or angry, I want revenge impulse. She simply wants to know what's become of her family in her absence, so that she can move on with her life in New Bordeaux. Until then, she loyally serves as Vito's number 2 at the River Row docks. As the elder Burke is presumably torturing the shit out of Roman Barbieri, he tasks Lincoln with helping his daughter Nikki reassert control over the moonshining operation. Nikki Burke is one of my favorite characters in the game, and I believe it's because I found her a powerful combination of vulnerable and authentic. She also endures a double dose of hardship in that, in addition to being a woman, she's also attracted to them. Her father doesn't seem to disapprove of this exactly, but it's easy to imagine that he poked fun and or be a disrespectful asshat on the subject at her expense. It's suggested that her brother accepted and loved her unconditionally despite society's attitude on the issue, and was a great source of support and comfort to her. True to the times, it's an open secret that no one dares speak about directly. It's clear that she's a strong woman, but around Lincoln, she lets her guard down, and there's an intimacy and shared respect between them that suggests they've known each other for many years. They're both victims of circumstance, and that they're caught up in the machinations of powerful men, and in truth wanted no part of that for their own lives. Nikki also struck a chord with me, I'm sure in part because my own family is both Irish and dysfunctional, and I've spent a large portion of my adult life trying to escape that specific legacy of alcoholism, narcissism, and short-sighted selfishness. Her southern accent and her red hair remind me of close family members who've had similar reactions to family incidents as she has to the loss of Danny. Nikki also stands out because she's one of the few people who feature in the documentary of Lincoln Clay. In 2016, she sits in a high-backed cushion chair at the ripe old age of 76 as she shares her memories regarding the game's events. This tells us two important details about Nikki, in that one, she survives the game's events and presumably abandons her father's criminal lifestyle, and two, even nearly 5 decades later, she remains deeply angry at her father's part in her beloved brother's death. Her pain aside, I loved this for her. Of all the people in Mafia III's cast, Nikki is one of whom I felt deserved a long and happy life, far removed from the murder and malice of the events of the 1960s. With the Hala, Row, and Point fully secured and their rackets fortified, it was time for Lincoln and I to turn our attention to the other districts in New Bordeaux. The first would be Barclay Mills. Just north of Delray Hala lies one of the least populated and most industrialized districts in New Bordeaux, packed with more industrial, less glamorous infrastructure like disposal services, a railway, a dock large enough to accommodate barges, and a lucrative mining quarry. Barclay Mills is the power center of an old school Italian mobster by the name of Enzo Conti. The rackets in Barclay are some of the most ghoulish and dangerous of the entire city. The garbage collection and waste disposal centers are gruesome fronts for body disposals for the Marcano's family. It would have been interesting to see the bodies of Marcano's street thugs we'd killed earlier in the game being disappeared here, but I'm afraid the developers didn't plan that far ahead. The railway, by comparison, is the path by which both domestic and imported firearms flood the streets of New Bordeaux and allow both the Marcanos and the Southern Union to maintain their control. At first, via phone, both Enzo and Lincoln threaten one another, but once they meet in person, Enzo recognizes Lincoln as Sammy's adopted son, and both men soften as they sink into the memory of the father and friend they both lost that day. I've mentioned multiple times before that Lincoln often harbors a murderous intent, as he did with Richie Doucette. He's far more reserved with Greco and Barbieri, allowing the long-standing grudges held by Vito and Burke to be avenged as they wish. Not so much with Doucette, as that was both personal and appropriate considering Cassandra got Lincoln to do her dirty work for her. But with Enzo, we see the first true example of Lincoln's wrath be placated entirely. And all it takes is a reasonable conversation with someone who recognizes Lincoln's loss and shares in that sadness with him. The Marcanos send a hit squad to deal with the sympathetic mobster, and Lincoln helps fight them off and delivers Enzo to safety at a hotel under the protection of the Hala. As they part in their very final interaction, Enzo once again apologizes for Sammy and Ellis, regretful for his part in empowering the organization that killed them. After stopping by Cassandra's to grant her leadership of Barclay Mills, I thought it best to take a small detour down the road and visit an old friend from the Hala, a man named Charles Laveau, as we embark on our first DLC of Mafia III, Faster Baby. On a small but well-armed and well-protected compound a few minutes outside the Hala, Charles Laveau leads a small chapter of black civil rights activists. They aren't explicitly identified, but I believe it's safe to assume they're similar to the Black Panther movement that was so heavily active at the time. Laveau is the man who provided the intel on Doucette's brothel earlier in the story. Formerly a bartender at Sammy's, he now spends his days as a civil rights activist who operates a covert radio broadcast urging vigilance and action against racism and espousing his own political beliefs, most of which are revolutionary and radical, which I feel were appropriate responses for the circumstances and events of the time, and ours even. His enthusiasm is well-founded, and the DLC focuses on a small, explosive event that threatens the balance of power in nearby Sinclair Parish, and by extension, serves as a microcosm of the entirety of the United States at this time. The county itself is idyllic and picturesque, but it hides a grotesque and rotten underbelly that belies its neighborly facade. On its face, Faster Baby seemed to be more of the lighthearted Smokey and the Bandit type romp throughout the picturesque Louisiana countryside. There's a nigh invincible El Camino type car called the Nightcrawler included here. It's Roxy's car. The player receives it as a reward by DLC's end. That allows the player a hell of a good time in destroying the town as a distraction. There are even long paths the player can drive by and disturb, Need for Speed Most Wanted style, causing them to crash into the police pursuers for points and slow-mo footage. It's not the best implementation I've ever seen, but it was fun and novel enough from the base game that I enjoyed it. These features, however, are not the meat of the content. Instead, Mafia 3's first DLC is deceptively important, as it examines just how and why white supremacy was and remains so goddamn persistent as a system that exists in American communities. In a cutscene, we're introduced to Sheriff Walter Beaumont, the most senior law enforcement officer in Sinclair Parish, and it's a great example of a tight, well-written scene that provides just enough characterization to help us both hate the man, but also show us exactly what we need to understand what the South was like at this time. Ezekiel, one of Laveau's partners and fellow civil rights activists, was coming back to New Bordeaux when Beaumont spotted him, alone after dark. For no other reason than the smarmy piece of racist shit wanted to, he shoots poor Ezekiel in the back of the head and spits on the man as he discovers the evidence amassed against him. Knowledge it's obvious he did not have before he shot and killed Ezekiel. I said the DLC focuses on this explosive event, but that wasn't entirely true. This event, this shooting of an unarmed black man, is explosive, but it's just a symptom of the overall system of white supremacy in effect in the United States at the time. And the system of white supremacy, not the individual shooting of Ezekiel, is what takes center stage throughout the DLC. I don't have footage of it because I didn't realize its significance until after I was wrapping up this portion of the game, but the story and theme of activists working to upset an unjust system is the driving force throughout Sinclair Parish, not the car chases. Another reviewer whose videos I usually love failed to comment on this plot thread, and I felt the omission a grave underestimation of what Faster Baby offers us in terms of perspective regarding these events. That's a lot of why I wanted to make this video and cover this DLC specifically. Early on, Roxy introduces Clay to MJ, a fellow Vietnam War veteran turned pot farmer, and together they collude to bring Beaumont to justice. What's interesting about the parish is that it isn't actually that difficult. The group retrieves the evidence that Ezekiel had collected, and though Beaumont tries to ambush them and steal it back, Roxy and Clay have little trouble in evading his trap and capturing the man to be held accountable for his crimes. Instead of killing him outright, they insist that he be exposed and his crimes be judged in a court of law. This is a powerful choice, as the judicial system in American law was rightfully considered so influential that they would carry the force of that justice done across the entire country. And that's exactly what happened in real life. Not to Beaumont, of course, as he is a fictional amalgamation of these historical asshats, but the precedent of holding white supremacists accountable in a court of law was extremely important in changing American culture into a more just and compassionate nation. What is difficult and laborious is to convince witnesses with knowledge of Beaumont's crimes to testify against him. A corrupt cop and a solid documented history of his wrongdoing just isn't enough, apparently. Even with his file of wrongdoings, even with the man himself in cuffs and custody, there's still no guarantee justice will be achieved without even more support against him. And that's where the people of the parish come in. There are 3 additional characters in Sinclair, all white men and women that can help take a stand against the man. One is the widow of a police officer killed by one of Beaumont's deputies when it found out he was trying to save evidence that would expose his crimes. She refuses to testify until the evidence is retrieved and she's kept safe. The second is the town's lawyer, whose wife was kidnapped and is to be held until Beaumont's trial. Obviously, he refuses to testify unless Clay can rescue her and guarantees their safety. Finally, the parish's pastor asks Lincoln to protect his congregation from the Southern Union as they seek to use violence to keep the whole town quiet. I spent a long time, months of my real life, trying to determine exactly what kind of game Mafia III is. For a while, I kept trying to decide on whether the game was a black power fantasy in which the player is supposed to feel empowered by being a black man who can single-handedly dismantle a citywide network of racism and oppression, or a black power fantasy, one that focused more on building up a coalition of like-minded allies and using the favorite tool of their oppressors, namely violence, in order to achieve some sort of liberation and justice. After vacillating between the 2 options, I realized I was being too narrow in my focus. In case you weren't aware, I'm a white man from the American South. I was raised primarily in the Deep South in the state of Georgia, but I've also lived in Florida, Texas, and Arkansas, none of which are particularly well known for their charitable views on diversity or opportunity for people who are not white. I was also raised to be racist, in a racist family. My mother, while she tried in her youth to raise me to look past such idiocy, has dropped the hard R in bomb in front of me as recently as 2020, as she's regressed in her principles to become someone I don't claim and don't recognize. I distinctly remember the casual, implicit racism that surrounded my grandparents' family dinner table at their farm for practically my entire childhood. My grandparents didn't consider themselves racist, of course, and I'm sure my mother and her siblings wouldn't dare claim the title, but a young boy can hear references to that colored boy down at the feed store and phrases such as, "Oh, that's mighty white of you, feller," only so many times before a certain understanding is indelibly stamped into his psyche regarding his family's viewpoints. My mother's also been partnered to a variety of men over my life, and almost every single one of them were at the very least implicitly yet obviously racist. I realized this very suddenly once in my late 20s as I was driving down the road with her boyfriend at the time. I was listening to rap on the radio, and the man passionately told me that I shouldn't be listening to it, that I should be listening instead to old-fashioned classic Americana and rock and roll. He was referencing artists like Frank Sinatra and Johnny Cash, ironically artists who were famously anti-racist, men who used their platforms to promote black artists and music, but the message was clear. This black shit is inferior, and how dare you for listening to it? How dare you for not appreciating and supporting your heritage? Considering I'm an American, my heritage and culture includes such excellent and diverse musicians as Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, Jimi Hendrix, and more recently, Reba McEntire, Kendrick Lamar, and Chappell Roan, among many tens of thousands of others. It seems to me completely idiotic and small-minded to omit so many non-white men and women who've so richly contributed to my culture and my life. But such is the idiocy of racism, closing off so much of the world, of life, of creation, over such a feeble-minded rejection of curiosity and a fear of difference and of the unknown. I decided instead that, at least for me, the game is a power fantasy of a different kind, one in which a single, righteously pissed off person can bring together a diverse coalition of like-minded but divided people who can be united and work together in unison to overthrow their unjust adversaries, opponents who created and maintained a system of oppression over them. The fact that the mechanism for this radical shift and change is violence is ultimately part of the fantasy. In real life, I have conflicting views on violence, but as a veteran of the United States military, someone trained and taught to take life and preserve it in equal measure, I freely admit I'm much more comfortable with it as a tool for political change than most. After all, generations of United States regimes wouldn't invest so heavily in military and law enforcement agencies if they didn't provide some sort of investment on their return. And as someone who's worked within that system, I understand better than most just how they operate to discourage dissent in people both at home and abroad. Despite how effective I perceive it to be, I also find the use of violence to be largely incompatible with the promise of America, of a homeland free of persecution, of discrimination, of perpetuating violence on others based simply on the fact that they have beliefs different from my own. The real-life idea behind using violence is that it's a simple and effective solution to what could be or become an enduring problem. Hit a person, put them down, and the rest will follow. Disappear a person, and the mystique surrounding their disappearance will keep the others in line, as the fear of the same thing happening to them spreads throughout communities. In a real 1960s New Orleans, the full weight of local, state, and federal governments would have been brought to bear against a man like Lincoln Clay, the Delray Hollow, and the larger Black American community at large. They would have hunted the poor man down like a dog, almost certainly enabling a pogrom or a similar campaign of violence across the American South on a scale not seen in the world since World War II. Kill a person, removing them from existence and their loved ones and communities entirely, and the implication, the hope, is that person's influence ceases to exist entirely along with their person. Not so. The reality of using violence is that it must become an enduring and expensive policy, both societally and socially, that must constantly be maintained with ignorance and fear until someone in a position of authority relents from the campaign and allows such policies to dissolve. I'm writing this less than a week after the shocking assassination of prominent right-wing political influencer Charlie Kirk, who was shot and killed in an event sponsored by the man at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. While the assassin has since been found to be more tied to the political right than left, the current administration and slew of right-wing influencers and politicians have wasted absolutely zero time in blaming their opponents and the American society at large, using the event to justify severely limiting and regulating the everyday civil rights enshrouded in the American Constitution. While the shooter's motivations are yet to be fully understood, the point I hope with the event's inclusion here is that his act of violence has much larger and farther-reaching consequences that none of us have yet to understand, and we likely won't for many years to come as those present moments of American instability continue to unfurl before us. There's a scene in the 2019 Call of Duty Modern Warfare reboot in the later mission The Wolf's Den, in which Gaz, the player's character in the sequence, participates in a raid meant to mimic a similar scenario to the 2011 assassination of Osama bin Laden. In a room on the first floor, there's a woman shielding a child on a bed with her body. As I was moving very swiftly through this sequence, when I got to her, her back was turned to me. In what was only a couple of seconds or less, the woman pushed the child toward the wall and reached for a firearm on the bed, and I distinctly remember the thought running through my mind, as consistently as an old-timey telegram transmission. Don't do it. Stop. Don't do it. Please stop. In that same moment, I squeezed the trigger. Swiftly, decisively, I put a single shot in her forehead and then 2 more in her chest as she fell to the ground. The child, who I assumed was her son, leapt from the bed onto her body, mourning the sudden and violent moment of her passing. I lingered. While that reboot is just another video game, just another entry in the long, unbroken, exhausting string of releases in the Call of Duty franchise, I was trying to meet the game in good faith and engage with it as a simulation as realistically as possible. With the full faith and knowledge that I engaged the hostile woman using the appropriate level of legal force in that moment, even though the simple squeeze of my trigger finger was thoughtless and mechanical, I mourned the woman and the child. As I swung my rifle back to the door I just walked through, my very next thought was, I just created a terrorist. The next few thoughts that flashed through my mind were about how that boy would grow as he became a man, about how he'd perceive the United States going forward, and about how this kind of violence in the real world is exactly how so-called terrorists are often radicalized and created, and how, if series mainstay Raul Menendez is any indication, we'd come back to wreck America's shit and see the cycle of violence perpetuated onward to the future. Faster Baby Sinclair Parish holds a mission in which the player has to interrupt a series of Southern Union's rallies, one at a trailer park and another at a nearby barn. It turned out to be one of my favorite encounters in the game. I found joy in spinning circles around them and slamming through their buildings. I had so much fun picking them off one by one, an army of one against a smattering of assholes. The red crosses on the bags they wore on their heads ironically made a hell of a convenient bullseye on their faces, and I took my time in lining up my shots, happy as hell to do so. I even made sure to double or triple tap the robe ones, as I wasn't certain if my initial shots would have been sufficiently lethal. The power fantasy of violence in a video game is simpler, and due to the very short-term nature of its consequences, is extremely appealing. There's no wife, no child, no neighbor in the house next to them on the street. There are no family portraits, no sign of their enduring place in the world, nor the hollow that would be left behind after I'd removed them. No one to come after me after the fact. This is simple. They're racists, assholes, enemies, and because they're pixels and code, they're people I don't have to have remorse or empathy for. Removing them from the world has few implications beyond a few less bullets in my firearm, and those are easily reloaded. The violence is mechanical, and the consequences of violence beyond that moment simply do not exist. Lincoln's campaign throughout the city is indeed a power fantasy, but it's a fantasy in which violence is that exceedingly simple solution to entire systems of complex problems. Shooting the men on the streets and bayous of New Bordeaux is simple and often cathartic. The mechanics of the game are smooth. They make committing acts of violence, whether covert or overt, smooth and straightforward, often to the immense satisfaction of the player. And make no mistake that Mafia III is a tremendously violent game. Unlike real life, this violence is extremely necessary, in part due to Mafia's nature as a video game, and in part due to its nature as a story of revenge, but it's also necessary in this fictional setting to wipe away the old and fetid ideologies of the past in order to make way for a safer, more equal society in which opportunity, illicit or otherwise, is more accessible to more people. By committing violence against the white supremacist structures that underpin New Bordeaux, my Lincoln created more opportunity for Irish, Italian, and Haitian immigrants. He made the city safer for sex workers and drug users, and cleaned up previously exploitative operations and ran them in a more egalitarian manner. Mafia III's assertion is that violence is sometimes necessary for a better world and a better future. All that's required is to remove a whole hell of a lot of racist assholes holding those structures together. In all three cases in St. Clair Parish, Lincoln is successful. He saves the evidence, retrieves the lawyer's wife, and protects the church from the mob of bag-wearing assholes. And then he calls in Laveau's people to smuggle all three witnesses to safety. What's so important about these tasks is that they reinforce that white supremacy is not a singular act of brutality, not just the shooting of a black man, but is instead a multifaceted system of coordinated omissions, suggestions, and subversions of evidence, of harm, of violence that reinforce racism and racist acts as the accepted status quo of the area in which it's practiced. It is only due to people who are willing to stand up to this kind of influence, sometimes at great personal risk, that any system like these changes for the better. And like real American history, these people succeeded. In an epilogue of sorts, Jonathan McGuire, the FBI agent hounding Clay's steps in the modern day, lets us know that Beaumont was indeed convicted of his crime, and he served over a decade in federal prison, receiving some leniency due to his own testimony exposing dozens of law enforcement and politicians of similar racist and racially motivated crimes. Sometime after his release, he was shot and killed in his driveway by an unknown assailant, just like the first Mafia's Tommy Angelo, presumably the exact same offense. We're about halfway through Mafia III at this point, and it's pretty apparent to me that this is about the time I became fatigued with the game's two fronts, one boss district structure, because when it comes to Tickfaw Harbor, I have almost no footage of the place. Tellingly, the wiki page for this district is also quite short with only 2 missions. The 2 racketeer are auto theft and smuggling, this time into Cuba by air instead of Vito and Alma's operation by sea. The underboss here is Frank Pagani, a smuggler who's been running cargo out of Cuba for the Marcanos. He also helps Sal's younger brother run casinos in Cuba and turns out to be quite knowledgeable about Sal's operation. During the reserve heist at the beginning of the game, it turns out Georgie was also tasked with stealing currency printing plates for a counterfeiting operation. The operation's gone badly, and Frank was tasked with fixing it by outsourcing to an expert we'll meet later. After Tickfaw, I decided to take a detour of sorts into the most superfluous of Mafia III's 3 DLCs, Stones Unturned. Unlike Faster Baby and Sign of the Times, there's not nearly as much for me to say about this one due to the fact that it carries much less meaning than its counterparts and seems to be here much more for gusto and gameplay of the shooting people variety. It's not altogether a criticism, as I enjoyed it quite a bit. It's just that after playing all 3, the excellent theming and presentation of the other 2 DLCs left it bogged down in the mud by comparison. The concept is evocative of buddy cop films in which the villain is one of the cop's long-lost colleague, in this case a CIA operator named Connor Aldridge. Aldridge is a reasonable enough villain, I suppose, except his entire motivation is pretty damn dumb, and he seems like a poor foil for the hyper-naturalistic Donovan. The premise of the DLC is that Aldridge is trying to find an American nuclear warhead that was lost at sea so that he can use it against the United States, mirroring the most extreme threat of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In an early scene of the DLC, Aldridge and his mercenaries raid a CIA safe house to get intel on the nuke, and the entire scene is pretty silly to me, as the CIA turncoat is portrayed more as a goofy-haired sadist rather than a professional intelligence officer, which is fitting, I suppose, if we're comparing him to the blonde Team America frat boy in Donovan. They're 2 sides of the same deeply stupid American coin. My cynicism aside, I said I enjoyed the DLC, and I very much did, as just after Lincoln and Donovan are ambushed on the top floor of an department store and have to shoot their way through dozens of mercenaries out to a weighted turreted vehicle for a fun escape sequence. The scene plays out as the domestic bliss of American consumerism clashes with the savagery of hardened Vietnam combatants in a deeply satisfying way, as hat boxes and perfumes explode alongside human flesh as bullets tear through each of them. Once they get the information they need about the nuke's location, Donovan and Lincoln find their way to an uncharted island off the coast of New Bordeaux, in what I think was supposed to be a sequence of encounters that was supposed to show just how the 2 men operated in Vietnam. And in truth, it's not a bad setup. The island is lush, thoughtfully laid out, and interesting to fight through, with mercenaries who are armed to the teeth in comparison to the base game's mobsters. I remember thinking how I wished we could get an entire spin-off game with just this playing out in Lincoln's Vietnam. After the jungle raid, we fight our way through a nuclear bunker silo that reminded me very much of the first Call of Duty Modern Warfare's same premise. It's slow, but it's fun, brutal, and methodical in equal measure. And much like the base game, the violence and brutality of these shootouts sell the package much more than any thematic pitch for it could. The inherent frivolousness of it is revealed shortly after, as we're treated to a cutscene with Aldridge and Donovan prattling on about loyalty and country, where Donovan shoots him, of course, American hero that he is, just before Lincoln invites Donovan out for some shrimp po' boys after a job well done. Then, as open-faced as that sandwich, they walk off into the sunset, just like so many action heroes at the end of so many action movies over the decades. Stones Unturned is in many ways the most earnest of the 3 DLCs, as it's not trying to say something nearly as much as it's trying to be something, which is just a damn good time similar to those same action movies it tries so hard to emulate. Back on New Bordeaux soil, downtown is another small district similar to Tickfaw in that it only has 2 missions. I found this a bit surprising when it came to writing this script, as the actual district felt comparatively large when I played through it. The rackets here are construction and blackmail, with Marcano Lieutenant Tony DeRazio, a ruthless money launderer, responsible for them. As always, exploring the rackets lead to some wonderful world building, seen here with these bodies that are presumably supposed to disappear into the foundation of the skyscraper. The rackets here are construction and blackmail, and it turns out DeRazio is running a highly effective blackmailing campaign against some of the city's most influential leaders that keeps them in the Marcano's good graces. There's a men's club / bathhouse that Lincoln can visit and discover a room specifically built for the purpose of baiting and recording men in illicit sexual encounters, in this case, a homosexual one between 2 men in a hot tub. DeRazio is an example of the tight but impactful writing Mafia III is so damn good at. He only has a couple of scenes and lines, but he's a wonderful example of how to characterize someone without overdoing it. He's described by others in the world as peculiar and as a weirdo, but in truth, he's just a sociopath, like so many other business leaders he's modeled after. He's a sinister professional who I felt was a wonderful foil for Lincoln's efficient but emotive brutality. His climactic encounter is also one of the most fun encounters in the game, as Lincoln can sneak or blast his way through his penthouse near the top of the Royal Hotel, inspired by New Orleans' real-life counterpart, Plaza Tower, a building that was completed a year after Lincoln's story. But like much of the city has since fallen into a state of disrepair as of the mid-2020s. It's a compact but fun fight in which Lincoln has to navigate the small, luxurious apartment amid a gunfight. Once he confronts DeRazio directly, the man wields a fucking rocket launcher and misses Lincoln, barely cracking the drywall on the back side, while an explosion blooms in front of Lincoln for dramatic effect. In truth, DeRazio has an excellent defensible position here and unlimited ammo besides, and it's only Lincoln's status as the protagonist that allows him to overcome the foe. DeRazio's cynicism and disregard for human life are on full display here, as he believes even his own demise won't mean anything in the larger scheme of things. Lincoln strongly disagrees, as does the rest of New Bordeaux, as the news report of his demise lights up the televisions of the city as another of Marcano's goons are laid low. Downtown claimed for Clay, the next rackets are among the oldest vices in human history: drugs and sex. Much earlier in the video, I made mention of how the Haitian marijuana operation was providing a public service via medicine and subsidizing the black community in the holla, as opposed to the addictive and corrosive heroin that was being trafficked there before Lincoln's intervention. My initial assessment of each racket's transformation was that they were all net positive that enriched the local district somehow, without being a similarly corrupting influence. Upon revisiting New Bordeaux more recently, I discovered that idealistic notion simply wasn't true. After taking down the French Quarter's drug racket, Clay's organization takes it over and continues trafficking the narcotics, including cocaine and heroin. At the very least, it does appear they aren't distributing it on the streets of New Bordeaux like the Marcanos, and are instead using the undercity canals to smuggle it out of the city to markets abroad. The sex operation is a bit more refined if puritanical, as Lincoln destroys an array of amateur pop-up pornography studios and the stag films archived on site. He also kills a few more deviant perverts the Marcano served, and hilariously robs the tamest and, for the record, only orgy I've ever walked through. It's not completely censored. There are some bare-breasted women, but for all of its maturity and strength in confronting themes head-on, such as racism, exploitation, and violence, Mafia 3 continues the series' tradition of being confusingly juvenile regarding sex and nudity. It's not all bad, as the game also includes a variety of issues of Playboy, just like Mafia 2 did, and we'll explore that in a bit, but it's still in poor contrast compared to how good the game is exploring other difficult issues. Mafia 3 is a massive step up in how the game treats women. I've already spoken about the excellent writing of Vito's right-hand Alma, Clay's lieutenant, and Cassandra, and how fond I am of Nikki Burke as a character. But there's also a small but distinct improvement over even Mafia 2 from a feminist perspective. In the slaughterhouse level of Mafia 2, there's a Playboy magazine in one corner of the building that features a Playboy centerfold named China Lee. In the basement of Sammy's bar, the same August 1964 issue lies under the basement stairs. I noticed the model was the same because I played the two games so close together, but there was a distinct difference I was pleasantly surprised by. In Mafia 2, the collectible shows just a single nude photo of Lee. In Mafia 3, the collectible shows the issue's cover, then the same partially nude photo of Lee as the previous game, but then continues to include a short article about her personality, her hobbies, and her lifestyle. In Mafia 2, Lee was a half-naked object to be ogled, while in Mafia 3's presentation, she's a career model, a professional woman who uses that career to further her personal goals and aspirations. Instead of just an object, Lee is a person we're invited to take more than just a skin-deep interest in. While not every Playboy collectible features this depth, a fair amount are just the month's cover and centerfold. It's a small but powerful step in a more egalitarian depiction of women within the wider series. In high school, I once had a political science teacher who asked us to list off whatever non-political magazines or other publications we could think of. Thinking myself very funny and clever in a room full of fellow teenagers, I offered Playboy. Our teacher was very patient and kind at my feeble attempt of humor, and she paused to inform us that Playboy had long considered to be one of the most prominent sources of in-depth information on politics and cultural icons, specifically due to the magazine's habit of featuring interviews of them within their issues. There's several examples of this in Mafia 3, such as print interviews with Stanley Kubrick and Ralph Nader, among others. With the sex rackets overtaking, there are three major figures Lincoln and the player have to contend with here. The first is federal judge Cornelius Holden. We're not told much about the man beyond the fact that he's in bed with the Marcanos and is highly valued by Sal as a man who will help legalize and therefore legitimize his casino he's building. But Holden holds an outsized role in a major plot thread that's been masterfully weaved throughout the game for players who've been paying attention. And I certainly was. This kind of storytelling isn't new to the Mafia series, as it's used during a mission in the Mafia 1 definitive remake as the play-by-play radio broadcast of a baseball game. And these kinds of parallel narratives are one of my favorites in games of this type. Throughout the game, avid listeners of the Mafia 3's in-game radio will perhaps have taken notice of a prominent story focusing on a local man named Hollis Dupree. Dupree is the center of a federal court case assigned to Judge Holden, and it concerns Dupree shooting and killing two young black men, Lamont Harris, age 24, and Trey McCall, age 25, who were alleged to have knocked on his door at home to ask for help with a flat tire. Dupree alleges he thought they were trying to break into his home and kill him, but that doesn't track with the fact that at least one of the young men was shot in the back. Holden sympathizes with the man and shares his white supremacist beliefs, and in this mission, Lincoln flat out hears him say that he plans to acquit Dupree of all charges. Mafia 3 came out in December of 2016. At that time, I was attending university as a fifth-year senior. I majored in history because I loved it so much I decided to just forego a minor entirely and instead loaded up my schedule with even more history. I graduated with my Bachelor of Arts just a few months later in May of 2017, but I never did make it this far into Mafia 3's narrative until years later, so the significance of this storyline escaped me completely. That last year, my schedule was loaded with African and Black American and media history specifically, and what I learned during those classes have been some of the most impactful and valuable lessons I've ever learned in my life, especially when it comes to media literacy. When I first approached Mafia 3's story, its characters, its themes, I remember at the time first approaching it from a those pasts are past kind of perspective. I remember looking forward to exploring an America that I didn't recognize, a culture with an obvious white supremacist bias that would bleed throughout the experience, one distant and distinct from me. What I didn't expect is to see my own reality in my shared lifetime alongside so many modern day Americans to mirror these past events so exactly. 4 years later, with Mafia III still well into my future and over half a century after its fictional events, there unfolded an event in the real life United States that shook the nation to its very core and served as a fundamental forward step in addressing the continuing injustices we share alongside our unjust and often racist heritage. Just a few miles inland from Jekyll Island, a small but popular tourist destination on the coast of Georgia, lies a small neighborhood called Satya Shores. In late February of 2020, a young black man by the name of Ahmaud Arbery, aged 25, was driven down, shot, and killed in an altercation caused by three white men, Travis McMichael and his father, Gregory McMichael, aged 34 and 64 respectively at the time, and their neighbor, William Roddy Bryan, aged 50, assisted the two men in trying to cut off Arbery's escape from them. The incident was a lightning rod for the nation, as Bryan had recorded the murder committed by the younger McMichael on his cell phone, footage that was freely released to the public and is still visible today. I remember watching the video the day it was released, and I do not exaggerate in the least when I say that I was stunned completely by the footage. In some ways, it's still so goddamn shocking at what we're seeing so far into the future after the civil rights movement, and such powerful strides have been made in regards to racism in this country. In many ways, the footage of the murder taken by one of the perpetrators himself was the most impactful and pivotal piece of evidence to the nation of what transpired, of what we're still seeing even in the 2020s. I remember it being so influential in the public psyche that both of the presidential candidates at the time, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, spoke out against the incident as a national tragedy and referred to it as a modern-day lynching. In less than 2 years, all three men would be convicted in both state and federal courts for having committed felony murder, attempted kidnapping, and a hate crime against Arbery. In November of 2021, about a year and a half after the murder, on the day their verdicts were announced, live on television for the nation and world to see, all three men stood silently as the consequences of their actions were laid out for them in a court of law in the state of Georgia. All three men were handed out life sentences that will far exceed any chance of parole for any of them. All three men have been deemed too dangerous to ever be set free within American society for the rest of their lives. It's horrifying to think of how many similarly minded white supremacists walk the American streets as they once did. I want you to know that as the broadcast of that jury's decision unfolded, an entire nation of people who believe in justice held their collective breaths as the judge solemnly read each verdict. I revisited those videos to write this part of the script, and even now, almost half a decade later, it's still difficult to watch that footage. Without having lived it, it's hard to explain just how impactful that announcement was, that justice was done for that young man. It's hard to explain what it felt like to watch Arbery's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, sit in that courtroom and hear that her son had not been let down by our justice system like so many young black men have been before him. Video footage of the injustices done to them is not something so many black men and women have had access to over the course of our history. That kind of swift and decisive condemnation and resulting accountability is not something so many people have access to over the course of our history. It's certainly not something the people of Mafia III's America could use to rally around in regards to the deaths of the fictional Harris and McCall. In this fictional case, in this game, Lincoln assassinates a federal judge to meet his own ends, but in doing so averts the complete failure of the American justice system to hold Hollis Dupree accountable of murder. While Holden had planned to acquit Dupree of all charges, his demise results in a mistrial, and Dupree is cut free due to administrative bureaucracy. Had I played Mafia III to completion when it came out, I most certainly would have felt differently, but playing it when I did, I so badly hoped that art would imitate life, and that Harris and McCall's murderer would be brought to justice as Arbery's were. Even as I write this in late 2025, the struggles of freedom and justice versus fascism and corruption play out just beyond my window in the same American South in which I've lived my entire life. One of the most important things I've learned in that last year of university, among so many other lessons, is that media that explores the past invariably holds a mirror to our present selves. And what I thought were events we had passed turned out to be staring me right in the face the entire time. This brings us to our next target on Lincoln's list, the first on the triad of underbosses just under Sal Marcano. In this case, it's his older brother, Lou Marcano, the so-called Santa Claus of New Bordeaux. The elder Marcano is one of my favorite characters in the game, not because I like him as a person, but because I adore him as a character. And I mean that both in the context of the game and also in the context of what he represents in towns and cities all over the American South. Lou Marcano is an example of what damn near every town I've ever lived in has, a true character, as in, that feller's a hell of a character. There's always some goofy-ass, larger-than-life asshole out there who, despite his failings, you cannot help but love him because he's so goddamn goofy and fun. He represents this archetype of someone everyone knows of, but only a few know well. He's someone who can get you what you need, but only if your needs are assuredly fucked up and not at all discussable within polite society. The fact that he's on the radio for most of the game inviting everyone to visit him just adds to the charm, and charm is something he seems to have in abundance, as he's also New Bordeaux's resident pimp, and those porn and sex rackets we took over, we snatched from him. Lou's confrontation is also a huge highlight of Mafia III, as it involves crashing a Louisiana casino riverboat beneath some rusty old riverside infrastructure and crashing the fundraiser of yet another would-be corrupt politician. This mission reminded me of Hitman Blood Money's death on Mississippi, and I loved it. Once Lincoln crashes the boat, you can see alligators feast on guests that were thrown overboard, and you can hear the screams of those caught both in the water and the explosion on board. As fun as Lou Marcano is, Lincoln Clay, and by extension the player, are here to crash this party and crush Lou underfoot as yet another rung on the player up to Sal. It's one of the most fun and satisfying shootouts of the game in my opinion, and in my footage you can see I tried to stay true to my version of Lincoln, and I opted to use my semi-automatic pistol when automatic fire would have resulted in needless civilian casualties. Once we catch up to Lou, we drag him off into the bayou, and he's never seen alive again. Lou doesn't respond well to his brother's death as Lincoln's efforts at psychological warfare bear fruit, and his panic is readily apparent as he scrambles on how to proceed with the casino plans. After taking down Lou in the historic French ward, I felt drawn to the final DLC of the game, Sign of the Times, due to its promise of an occult angle. I'd hoped for a more distinct storyline that would be darker than the base game's content and other DLCs. I was disappointed. As much as I like the other DLCs, Sign of the Times is by far my favorite as it has more of a horror film vibe, evocative of psychedelic horror films that use drugs and occultism as central themes, the most recent of which I've seen is the wonderfully surreal 2018 Nicolas Cage film, Mandy. The DLC begins with Father James and Lincoln visiting the burnt-out Sammy's bar, and they meet a young woman being accosted by masked assailants. After a quick gunfight, we learn the young woman's name is Anna McGee, and she's one of the very best characters Mafia III has to offer. Not necessarily because of her role within the story, but due to her strength of character and performance by her actress. She's extremely convincing as a strong central survivor of adverse circumstances who ultimately succumbs to them in tragic fashion. Anna's story is a bit of a stereotype in that she's a young, vulnerable woman trying to make it in a big city. She's a waitress who has to endure the unwanted advances of her manager, and she's barely hanging on via her meager wages. Her life is one of underappreciated toil and little prospect for bettering herself. It's little wonder why she'd put what little faith she has left in someone, anyone, who can just see her pain, and acknowledge it as a fellow human being. Enter Bonnie Harless, the hostess of Nuit Blanche, a local nightclub that's been a front for her religious cult, the Ensanglante, a French word that translates roughly to covered with blood or simply bloodstained. The blood cult was founded by a fictional Confederate general named Braxton Harless, an ancestor of Bonnie, and is an organization explicitly of white supremacy ideology, using discrimination to justify castes of privilege and dehumanization. As a group, they worship a deity they know as Père Sanglant, or Father Blood, and their goal is to incarnate him into a figure they call the Blessed, a human born with the deity's soul and likeness. Bonnie has chosen Anna to carry that child for the cult due to their distant shared relation with Braxton, believing that only their pure, well-born bloodline is up to the task of heralding their fiendish patron into the world. While it's not explicitly stated within the game, the overwhelming suggestion is that the cult uses their influence to entice and ensnare poor, marginalized, and desperate people just like Anna into their ranks. Further, Bonnie uses a drug called Sky, an intense hallucinogen, to suggest and coerce her followers into whatever she wants while they're enthralled within the experience. Her closest tools she uses are so-called harless girls, young women strung out on Sky with absolutely no problem going batshit on their targets. As a general rule, I'm not fond of disparaging women, but in this particular case, I feel I can freely and justifiably say that these are some crazy bitches who terrified the shit out of me every time I encountered them. And Lincoln Clay, distinguished gentleman that he is, simply will not engage the women lethally the same he does with male foes, deciding instead to render them unconscious. I, however, in part due to being scared of them, but also practicality, shot the absolute shit out of them as soon as I could get my weapon out and pointed in their general direction. They're excellent enemies that Mafia III uses as well, and it's a shame the studio didn't do more with more enemy types in the base game, because they were so fun. I was fucking terrified, but they're so fun. In trying to aid Anna and track the cult's activities, Lincoln has to travel throughout various districts of the city and explore New Bordeaux's local history. This was another welcome change to me, as both the previous DLCs largely took us away from New Bordeaux proper, but beyond the final zone, this DLC takes us to buildings we weren't allowed to explore before now. How they present this is a fantastic presentation style formatted in a sort of crime scene forensic investigation very similar to 2011's LA Noire. It's slight, more presentation style than true interactive mechanic, but it's a welcome and interesting change I wish we'd see more of in these types of games. The sites are places of great tragedy and trauma and include an abandoned Confederate mansion, a burnt-out middle school, warehouse on the grounds of a former slave auction site, and more. Each site presents a separate piece of the overall puzzle that help us better understand the Ensanglante's rituals and beliefs and drives us to the climax of the story. They also do a great deal to show us just how depraved this cult is, as each of them holds the remains of people who have been brutally and ritualistically murdered by the cult. Up until this point, it's been clear to anyone paying attention that Anna has been in great distress, and the DLC suggests that this is somehow tied to the so-called magic of the cult. It's hogwash, of course, and it's clear that the young woman is traumatized and exhibiting obvious signs of severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. It's often very difficult for her to focus and fully articulate her thoughts and feelings, which probably isn't helped by the Sky given to her by Harless. Anna and Lincoln share a wonderful dynamic that helps better flesh out Lincoln as a character as well, because he's gentle with her, patient, understanding, compassionate, nothing like the brutally efficient killer he so often is in the game. These scenes go a long way to remind us that Lincoln is no stranger to loss or trauma, and he empathizes with those who have gone through great tragedies and come out on the other side very much scathed and not quite whole, whether in the brutal jungles of Vietnam or the concrete one of New Bordeaux. In a dilapidated opera house, the cult is taken as a gathering place of sorts, primarily for sexual rituals designed to lure in more members. Lincoln learns the true extent of Anna's abuse. In a really powerful scene that I admire for its restraint, Lincoln comes across a recording of Harless and the cult's so-called high priest, some random asshole I couldn't find a name for, coercing Anna into becoming impregnated on behalf of the cult's goals. It's a powerful scene, as a less tasteful, less experienced writer would have shown it more explicitly in a feeble-minded attempt at shock value. What we're shown is his fear and helplessness coupled with Lincoln's indignation and rage. Seconds later, the so-called high priest gets the drop on Lincoln, and it's clear the man has absolutely no remorse for his actions, and Lincoln's silent yet decisive wrath is well deserved. Just because justice is done does not mean that justice is restorative. For Anna, there's nothing for it. She says, quote, "I prayed to God every night, deliver me some kind of love, some kind of protection, hope. And Bonnie made me believe she could give that to me. That was a lie. I was just a vessel for her," end quote. In one of the most effective scenes in the entirety of the game, rivaled by only one other in my opinion, Lincoln pleads with Anna as she mourns her own fate, unwilling to continue the trauma and decision inflicted upon her by the will of Bonnie and her damned cult. Quote, "They can't control me," she says. "Not anymore." End quote. Anna takes her own life, and Lincoln and Father James can do little but mourn her. And even James does little to dissuade Lincoln from pursuing justice for the young woman. The actual climax of the DLC takes place on a small island within a sanitarium reclaimed by the cult. What follows is some sing-song, horror, fairy tale type bullshit the game wants us to attribute to some magical influence, but in truth is almost certainly a result of the sky Lincoln was drugged up with by Harless much earlier in the DLC. I didn't dislike it actually, despite how I sound about it. The art and the character design here strongly reminded me of what the Dishonored games did with its Brigmore Witch faction. I was just anxious to confront Bonnie. The final encounter with her is climactic indeed, and the player can actually fail the quick time prompt here, and Bonnie brutally stabs Lincoln to death and sends the player back to a checkpoint restart. Past it, however, and their final interaction plays out. The final cutscene of the DLC is yet another touching moment as Lincoln and Father James lay Anna to rest in a tomb with the rest of his adopted family, Perla, Sammy, and Ellis. As an orphan himself, it was a powerful gesture to me that Lincoln cared for the young woman so much that he made sure to lay her to rest with the shared love and memory of his lost family rather than some unmarked grave in isolation. Going back over the footage for this, I realized I forgot to mute my mic while I was playing, and in the audio, I could hear myself crying for Anna and for Lincoln. And even as I tape these words, I'm crying yet again, so touched I was by the respect and affection the two men showed for the young woman as they let her go and turned back to the separate paths of their lives. With that microcosm of justice and revenge laid to rest, I turned my attention back to the Marcanos. Throughout the video, I haven't specified to whom I distributed leadership of which rackets among our three lieutenants. I intend to save that full explanation for a future video, but for now I do need to specify a few as we more fully explore them in turn. The first is Cassandra. Cassandra is one of the best characters in Mafia III due to once again the excellent restraint shown by Mafia III's writers. From the very first moment we meet her, we're off balance and unsure, and that's very much by design on Cassandra's part, for what cannot be examined cannot be understood. There seems to be a lot of people who don't care for Cassandra, I assume because she's a black woman who gives Lincoln a lot of lip, and she's hostile for a large part of the game, but in truth, she's an excellent addition to the Clay crime family. While it's true that she's manipulative and knows how to work from the shadows, she also knows what to say and how to convince people to do what she wants, even Lincoln, as she manipulates him directly several times within the game. She's strong-willed and willing to do what it takes to protect herself and those she cares about, and in some players' futures, she brings the wrath of a woman scorned down on New Bordeaux's many malcontents if Lincoln leaves the city to her. She's the intelligence and assassination specialist of the Clay crime family, and I wouldn't want to run the city without her. For the climax of each lieutenant, they ask Lincoln to fulfill a series of tasks to make them whole, to maximize their potential to earn before we finally reach the top of this very tall mountain we've been climbing together. In Cassandra's case, it's stealing guns. We don't know a lot about Cassandra. We're told that's probably not even her real name, but near the end of the game, she opens up a bit as a sign of good faith toward Lincoln and recognition of how well he served her interests. While she previously told us her sister had been abducted and killed by Richie Doucette's men, she revises her story and admits that it was actually her daughter who was killed by them. She attributes this due to the lack of any tools she had with which to protect herself or her daughter, and she's vowed never to make that mistake again. Earlier in the game, a bit before meeting Enzo Conti and Barclay Mills, there sits a train depot in the area that serves as a hub for gun running. As it's just north of the Hollow, I gave it to Cassandra's gang to run, in part because of its proximity, but also because I wanted the community to have firearms in case they ever had cause to defend their community from exploitation again. That decision, dozens of hours ago, reemerges with this new context as a meaningful and fortuitous decision in a way I simply couldn't have predicted that early on. And yet again, we see the maturity and interconnectedness of Mafia III's expert writing. With Cassandra and the Hollow armed to the teeth, I felt it was time to move on to the last few districts in New Bordeaux, revisiting my last two lieutenants along the way. South Downs is one of the last districts held by the Marcanos, and this one is under the leadership of Sal's younger brother, Tommy Marcano. He's described as Sal's favorite and reportedly wanted him to graduate and get a legitimate non-criminal job, but he insisted he wanted to work for his big brother Sal. He's effective in this role, as he was the one running those casinos in Cuba and has been in the South Downs since he was ousted by Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution. The other racket here is black market goods, where the Marcanos steal high-end merchandise off of truck shipments and sell that to customers, cutting out the retailers and keeping all the profits for themselves. Lincoln's especially pissed and motivated to get to Sal as he's discovered the ruse of the heist. Sal didn't care nearly as much for the money like Sammy, Burke, and the others did. He wanted the printing plates for himself so he could launder money through the casino. Sal's offers to bring his business partners up was bullshit from the very beginning. To get to Tommy and by extension the plates, Lincoln's big black ass goes undercover of sorts at a local boxing gym to get close and take them down. It's a fun sequence in which Lincoln has to win 3 rounds in the ring against progressively more difficult foes. His disguise is so super effective that Tommy clocks him immediately, and Lincoln wakes up tied to a weight machine as the mobster threatens to set him aflame. He fails, of course, as we get to break through the ropes and viciously fight our way through the burning gym with the plates in hand. Tommy's not a bad character, but he doesn't have the panache or spectacle that his older brother Lou did. What he's most memorable for, in my opinion, is the fact that Sal's so fond of him. As smuggling and gambling are right up Vito's alley, the South Downs go to him, and we go to Vito to deliver him the news personally. Vito's terminal mission is a major highlight for anyone familiar with Mafia II's ending, and Vito asks for Lincoln's help in making things right. In the final moments of that game, Vito and the player's best friend Joe Barbaro was diverted away from Vito after they killed a major rival, and while Vito was exiled to New Bordeaux, Barbaro was reported to have been savagely beaten and killed by a crew of mobsters in Lost Heaven. We later learned that isn't true, but for Vito, this is the final nail in a decades-old coffin, and I'm glad we can give him that peace that he sought for so long. He's thankful to Lincoln, and his loyalty to the Clay crime family is assured. Frisco Fields is by far the most affluent and most mysterious of all districts in New Bordeaux. Because it's primarily a residential area, I couldn't figure out what the hell the rackets would be. I was surprised to find that they were the most ghoulish of all. One is the production and distribution of PCP, an organization Clay's organization continues with, but the other is human slavery. In a goddamn grocery store of all places, the Southern Union's been running a modern slave market of black people to wealthy white patrons. It is supremely fucked up, and I and Lincoln made it clear how we felt about it to all of those involved. There are 2 other sites with more trafficking victims, and we rescue those as well. Much like Lou Marcano's time on the radio earlier in the game, there's been another presence with much more prominence throughout our time in this city, a community leader named Remy Duval. Rather than being on a couple of ads like Lou was, Remy has been on what feels like hours and hours of talk shows, editorials, and opinion broadcasts. The man simply will not shut the fuck up. To finally meet the man behind the mic was something I look forward to, and even more so once I realized he was the leader of this chapter of Southern Union asshats. Frisco Fields allows another more fruitful opportunity to thin out the Southern Union's ranks, and that's when confronting Remy Duval. Our next stop is essentially a Klan rally, and Remy's our central target. Considering he's surrounded by over a dozen bagheads, he's surprisingly easy to take down. After doing so, we set him up and set him alight for all the city to find. And like clockwork, once Lincoln's handiwork is found, the city's law enforcement are rightfully terrified. I distinctly remember how I planned out the encounter. My mindset wasn't of role-playing Lincoln's fury, anger, hatred, or rage at possibly confronting such a group of men. Instead, my mindset was mechanical, and one almost entirely focused on efficiency. My priority was to ensure not a single one of these motherfuckers escaped their white boy social club. There's some on the periphery of the rally, which is a true real thing that happens, by the way, as even the KKK tries to be somewhat discreet with their open-air rallies. They do have security and such. They don't actually want people to see these, partly because of the larger modern societal consequences like social isolation and job loss, but also simply because it really is a white boy man-child social club. And if you're not excited to go already, you're almost certainly not invited. After taking out the guards, the purge continued with a question I didn't even have to ask myself. How do I take all of them out as quickly and efficiently as possible? Again, the question became mechanical, sterile, one without passion, but full of mathematical considerations, like how many racists can I fit in a frag grenade's radius? About 30, it turns out. I counted. The remaining half dozen fell quickly enough to a mag and a half of AK rounds. In real life, I would never consider such an act. Shooting 30 plus people seems unconscionable, but in Mafia III, it's damn fun, and we made the world a better place besides. That's the fantasy of Mafia III. You have some racists, you add some bullets, you remove some racists, and the world becomes a better place, literally overnight. It's simple, effective, and there's no reason to think of the 30 or so funerals that would otherwise occur if this weren't just a video game. I had another interesting conflict with Mafia 3 as I progressed through it, and that was reconciling my acts of violence as Lincoln with my beliefs as a white man who's lived nearly his entire life in the American South. Am I a bad person for agreeing with Lincoln? For perpetuating the violence across the city, for taking more lives in 60 hours than the Marcanos could take in years? Ultimately, I don't think so. I'm saved from Mafia 3's nature as a video game, as fantasy made possible by electricity, pixels, and code, but it was still a train of thought I stayed with and explored for quite a long time. It's possible that the scourges of racism and white supremacy will be best relegated to the memory of history by readily employing violence and a wider societal pressure upon those who practice it. My evidence of this belief stems from the fact that these feeble-minded discriminatory idiocies are enjoying a resurgence in the mid-2020s and seem to have been doing so for most of my life. Compared to the worst excesses of those philosophies becoming widely adopted, for example, during World War II, in which tens of millions of people across the world allied together to fight, shoot, kill, and otherwise prosecute and execute millions of Nazis, fascists, and other violators of human rights, a more widespread, more casual philosophy of violence designed to lay those political ideations low sometimes seems reasonable. I don't mean via vigilante murder or extrajudicial killing, by the way, as those are indeed extreme solutions, but I do feel, based on my own life experiences, that I wish I'd been more empowered to punch people in the face far more often throughout my life. I feel the same on behalf of other people as well, as I often read casual reports on Reddit, for example, in which people complain of exploitation of work, of abuse in their personal relationships, and further victimization in their everyday lives. Even after this violent anti-racist campaign, there still remain racist assholes in New Bordeaux. Walking around the city, whether on its city streets or one of its many fine establishments under the stewardship of the Lincoln crime family, will invariably result in more casual racist comments being thrown Lincoln's way. Mean words are much less threatening than gunshots and grenades, of course, but I often found them more offensive and more infuriating than the gunfights I'd been in throughout the game. Much like real life, I was annoyed that the law's monopoly on violence didn't allow me to punch them in the face, but did allow them to spew hate speech in mine. There's a fantastic series that came out of Australia in 2018 called Mr. In Between. It follows a contract killer and family man named Ray Shoesmith as he navigates the complexities of each of his dual lives. After a violent incident in which he assaults two younger men for assaulting him and his daughter, he's mandated group anger therapy. And there's a couple of exchanges within those sessions which help me better articulate my long-held feelings on the subject of more casual societal violence. In an earlier meeting, the group's therapist asked Ray to justify the use of violence in resolving the incident. Quote, "Can you remind me again what that reason was?" "Well, they were being assholes." "The world is full of assholes, Ray. You do realize that?" "Yeah, and you know why?" "Why?" "Because people let them get away with it." End quote. This kind of casual, persistent justice is one that I sometimes feel would better serve communities in general, as opposed to the tightly regulated use of force monopolized by the state. In a later exchange I didn't realize was in the show until I watched more of it for this part of the script, Ray reports another incident in which he assaulted a man at a family Christmas event for once again being rude to his young daughter. The therapist asks, quote, "How did your girlfriend feel about this?" "Well, she's not my girlfriend anymore, so..." Without wanting to state the obvious, can you see perhaps how violence is not the best way for you to resolve your disputes? I think it generally is, but, just don't do it in front of your girlfriend, end quote. After some group laughter, their therapist continues, quote, "What's so great about it? Doesn't seem to have worked for you this time." Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, Can you give me one example of violence ever working? World War II. World War II? We didn't beat the Nazis just by talking to them. We used violence. End quote. I'm editing out a bit of the conversation here for brevity, but Shoesmith continues, quote, "I'm not saying I should have done what I did, but I don't think you can say that all violence is bad. I think there's good violence and bad violence." The therapist asks, "What's good violence?" And a fellow group member replies with a smile, quote, "World War II, end quote. It's a well-written exchange that expresses a consistent worldview based on real-world events, real-world history, and the fact that real-world injustices often remain left to endure as persistent wrongdoings. The world is full of assholes and continue being assholes because people, both weak and strong, near and far, keep letting them get away with it. While Remy was the face of the operation, it turns out he's just a rung below the true leader of the district, Sal's sister-in-law, Olivia Marcano, the last of Sal's 3 lieutenants. In short, I like the woman. Her confrontation is particularly memorable as we're tasked with infiltrating Remy's wake and drugging all of the mourners with a potent CIA hallucinogenic concoction so that we can get close to her. Like most encounters in the game, this is a fun sequence that was one of the most memorable as it required more strength and reaction early on. Lincoln doesn't kill the woman as it's against his moral code, but Georgie doesn't have those same concerns, and Olivia is dispatched for her failures to maintain the situation as Sal needed. Once Remy and Olivia are wiped off the field, Frisco goes to the Irish. Our final lieutenant to take care of before moving north to the casino is Thomas Burke. The Irishman is a relatively simple request. He wants Lincoln to steal and return cars, a venture any completionist of Mafia II will easily recognize from the docs in that game. His early explanation is that they're going to the Irish Republican Army back in Belfast, but after a couple of deliveries, he lets us know that isn't quite true. Thomas Burke is dying. His many years of hard drinking have finally caught up to him in the form of liver cancer. In his last days, his hope is to amass enough cash that he can pass it down to his daughter Nikki, give her a better life, as one last gesture of a loving father before he passes on. It makes Lincoln promise not to reveal his secret, and while we don't ultimately know Burke's fate, we do know that Nikki lives a long life, and it's safe to assume her father was somewhat successful in his efforts, no doubt thanks to Lincoln. All that remains is the casino, or at least the shell of it, considering Lincoln has ensured it'll never open under Marcano's stewardship. There's a long drive across a bridge and one excellent final shootout against mobsters personally led by Georgie Marcano. True to the rest of the mobsters in the game, these aren't up to the task of stopping Lincoln Clay, and as he takes his time in dispatching his old friend, they share a final exchange. While Lincoln thought Georgie was just too damn proud and entitled to accept Lincoln's independence, it turns out that his concern was for his father, for his approval, for his love, same as Lincoln and Sammy. Lincoln kills him and leaves him behind to finally confront his father. I mentioned earlier that there were 2 scenes in the game that I felt were the most impactful, most artful. Anna's was the first, and this is the other. Lincoln's final confrontation with the elder Marcano was one that's deftly written and skillfully performed. As Lincoln approaches him, Sal opens up a bottle of whiskey he's been saving for the casino's opening, and the 2 men share a drink over their last fateful conversation. Much like his son, Sal did all that he did to others he did out of love for Georgie. He didn't want his son to live the same fearful and dangerous life he'd lived his entire. I loved it. This was the culmination of dozens of real-life hours, hundreds of bodies, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and a not insignificant amount of blood, sweat, and tears. And it was all worth it. Every shot, every fight, every moment, it was all for this, a face-to-face conversation with the man who killed Lincoln's family. I couldn't ask for a better end than to see Lincoln's iron will be done in this intimate way. Downstairs in front of the husk, Lincoln and the player have just fully hollowed out, arrives a familiar face to veterans of the franchise. Vito's longtime mentor, Leo Galante. I said in another video that the Mafia series was largely Vito's story, as he touches the lives of most of the cast in the games, but with the release of Mafia the Old Country, the fourth game, but chronologically first in the series, I have to revise that and replace Leo as its center, as he plays a prominent role in those early days in Sicily, all the way to 1916 New Bordeaux, and even possibly beyond. He once again reminds us that he's a fair man by organized crime standards and lets Lincoln know of his new obligation to the hierarchy he now serves under if he chooses to remain in the city as Sal Marcano's successor. Mafia II players also get the answer to a question that long simmered between games and was even subverted in this one, as we see Joe Barbaro, alive and well, playing Galante's chauffeur as he nods to the player in recognition of their meeting yet again. A secret joy for us that Lincoln nor Vito are ever allowed to learn. With the Marcanos dead and the entire city of New Bordeaux under the firm control of the Clay crime family, I understand how one might think that the game was over. But it wasn't. Not for me, at least. In truth, I rolled credits on Mafia III back in April of 2022. It's mid-September of 2025 as I write this, late October of 2025 as I record this, and yes, I've been thinking about this game almost incessantly for over 3 years. I'm not obsessed, I promise. I haven't replayed the game since then, nor do I intend to, and I've played many other hours of games besides, but the game never left me because I found it too valuable a microcosm of American culture and history to want to leave it behind so soon. As I said earlier in the video, I really love history. There's one final exchange after Sal's death in which Lincoln reports back to Agent Donovan and his father James that the deed has been done. In his video looking at the game, my favorite critic Noah Caldwell-Gervais states, by the end, quote, by the end of the game, mechanically and spiritually, was very weary of murder, end quote. Before I played the game myself, I imagined that I would feel much the same way and choose the same ending he did, where Lincoln leaves New Bordeaux for good. Father James reminds him of that dream and urges Lincoln to leave, to begin his life anew, to leave his sins behind, to live in peace, and spend his life as James has, essentially repenting for his murderous deeds. I thought I would do this in the first hour or so in the city because that's the man I felt Lincoln was at the time, a humble veteran who wanted to travel and see the nation. But something had changed in Lincoln and in me during our time together. Lincoln himself points out that it's not him running the high table. It'll be someone worse, just like the Marcanos. Agent Donovan advises Lincoln to dispose of his assets, to kill his lieutenants, and rule the city all by himself. But that advice didn't sit well with me either. I decided to take my time before deciding what to do with the power I and Lincoln now held over the city. I lingered. I spent more time with Lincoln as we roamed the city, visiting stores and restaurants, cleaning up remnants of Marcano's rule, and at times just driving around listening to music. I visited each of our lieutenants in turn, exploring how they lived. Burke has a pretty small living space behind the front wall of his shop, very much appropriate for the drunken bachelor he is. And Vito's kitchen has a table eerily reminiscent of his mother's table in 1940s Empire Bay. We're never allowed into Cassandra's room, kept private by the writer's consistent excellence in keeping with their mystery. And beyond that, we're able to rebuild a piece of New Bordeaux in Lincoln's image. Faster Baby's weed farm, coupled with the rackets we control, allow us to collect tens of thousands of dollars at regular intervals, and beyond the base game's upgrades, we're presented with the opportunity to meet Sammy's sister and rebuild Sammy's bar. It's a system of gradual purchase and upgrades I assume are meant to last over a longer duration than it took me, simply because I saved as much as I could and dropped a bundle on most of the upgrades at once. It's a feature that conflicts with the base game a bit, as Father James specified early on that the ruins of the bar endured well into the 2010s, but I think this was a retcon to allow the player to somehow invest the money they'd earned and leave a lasting mark on the city and give back to Delray Hollow whether they decided to leave New Bordeaux or not. Aside from it being a satisfying feature of the DLC, it also helped me feel more connected, more contributive to the city than I already had. It was gratifying to make my mark on the city in a way that complemented both my wealth, but also the fact that I was employing people with legal and meaningful jobs and providing the community with another place to relax, unwind, and socialize. Providing livelihood, a means to feed and clothe themselves and their families, and provide leisure to them besides, is a powerful responsibility, one that I feel is often overlooked in our modern American society. And it felt good to provide that here and follow in Sammy's footsteps in doing so. Besides walking through the basement to inspect Lincoln's bedroom like I had our lieutenants, touring the finalized renovated bar, ascending to the upstairs office to sit down and enjoy a glass of whiskey, I took the time to take pride in how peaceful the streets of New Bordeaux felt to walk after the city had been cleansed of the Marcano and Southern Union's racist and corrosive influences. Looking back on the entirety of New Bordeaux and all the districts and all the rackets I'd taken over, with all that money rolling in, I had an opportunity to reflect on the violence I committed along the way and come to terms with how I felt about New Bordeaux overall. In the beginning, I thought that after I and Lincoln had stopped these Marcano assholes from getting away with it, that I would leave New Bordeaux for good. But something had changed in Lincoln and in me during our time together. I didn't become some bloodthirsty kingpin drunk on power, high on hubris and selfishness. Instead, I looked to the future of New Bordeaux and decided to act on what I felt was best for the people of the city I'd fallen in love with. There are 5 different endings for Mafia III, one for each of Lincoln's lieutenants, should the player decide to leave one of them the city to rule, another in which the player follows Donovan's advice to kill them all, and a final decision to stay and rule the city, with whichever lieutenants remain alive after killing Sal Marcano. Leaving the city to Cassandra just didn't seem sustainable to me, as the Haitian gang fell apart instantly once faced with a competent adversary, and because the Hollow was powerless to stand up against the Southern Union. Even with the influx of firearms via the train depot in Barclay Mills, the federal government, still infected with racists, could easily marshal the resources necessary to cut off that supply and kill Cassandra's operation, thereby once again reducing New Bordeaux to a city of white supremacy and oppression. Leaving the city to Burke was never under consideration. As a sexist, homophobic, and at times casually racist, dying alcoholic Irishman felt like a recipe for disaster, as I felt the alliances I'd forged in the game would quickly fall apart due to administrative neglect and ethnic conflict. Leaving the city to Vito did give me a bit more pause, considering he's the protagonist of the second game and had ended the life of the protagonist of the first. That would have been a more sentimental choice. However, leaving Vito as the head of the New Bordeaux Empire and yet still beholden to the Empire Bay Mafia families seemed like a cruel fate for the man. While I'm not particularly fond of Vito, I'm not generally cruel to loyal people just trying to do their best with what they have. The choice to wipe them all out and rule the city alone without any aid whatsoever also seemed idiotic and short-sighted to me, which fits for the frat boy Donovan, but doesn't fit for me. Even Sal Marcano entrusted the day-to-day operations of various districts to his lieutenants, and I had a hell of a time dislodging those people from those positions. Whatever my feelings for the 3 as individuals, I'd grown fond of each of them and the services they provided me mechanically as the player. And besides, I didn't want to lose such diversity of ability due to some short-sighted personal dislike of any of them, because that's exactly what Marcano did, and that's exactly what led to him being put into the ground right beside his beloved son. Finally, that left me with one choice. The only choice that I kept logically and emotionally coming back to. I had to stay. I had to continue being the reason New Bordeaux was clear of such violent and persistent racism and such inequality. In real life, if I were a master criminal with an array of rackets and wealth at my disposal, I hope I'd use it to help people, to create great jobs with high wages, both legal and illicit, and I'd invest in that city, as does Lincoln. Jonathan McGuire, the FBI agent who so prominently featured throughout the game's documentary in his old age, never did catch Lincoln Clay. For almost 50 years, the man has hounded Lincoln's trail throughout his criminal career, trying to make some charge stick that would hold the man accountable for his many murders and millions of dollars of contraband he's generated and distributed across the U.S. to no avail. Agent Donovan was last seen on national television in the late 1960s, shooting and killing Senator Blake, naming him as a co-conspirator of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. According to the game, the decision to stay and rule the city results in the loss of the only man who ever loved him, Father James. I call bullshit. Over the course of the entire game, Father James has been urging Lincoln to choose peace, to choose passivity, to follow the teachings of the Bible and turn the other cheek, to flee from the conflict, to live a peaceful life. Again, I call bullshit. His motivation is largely personal, as James laments the deeds he carried out in a similar situation to Lincoln's deployment to Vietnam. In an exchange between the two men later in the game, Lincoln states, quote, "Doubt anyone's losing sleep over some dead Nazis." Father James replies, "That's not the point. The men I killed, killing them should have meant something to me. Should have had weight, but it didn't. And glimpsing what it was buried down inside me, it was too much." Lincoln replies, "I know who I am." Father James, "I know you do, son. That's what terrifies me." End quote. James insists that Lincoln follows his beliefs, his fears, his limitations as a human. His belief and insistence of nonviolence is respectable, and I admire him greatly for that. But as I watch the foundations of American democracy crack around me in real time as I write this, I have even less patience than I had as a younger man for theories and attitudes that allow injustice and impropriety to flourish freely of interference guided by the temperance of equality and compassion. Much earlier in the game, just before Lincoln and Donovan leave for the ruin of Sammy's bar, Lincoln says to James, quote, "You taught us kids to turn the other cheek, not fight back. Problem is, that don't work. Not in the real world." Unlike its predecessors, Mafia III isn't the years-long journey that Mafia players were used to. Instead, protagonist Lincoln Clay's story takes place over just a few months, from February to October of 1968. These few months did a great deal for Lincoln and for me, because it helped convey the force of righteousness that an entire focused and empowered community can become. In this way, Mafia III serves as a powerful message for those who may feel powerless during uncertain times. Mafia III isn't the best game in the series because it's the largest, most ambitious of the series. Mafia III is the best because of how richly it ties the disparity of American experiences together to create a simulated microcosms of one of the most storied cities of American history, one that endures to this day as a hub of culture, commerce, and yes, even crime. It's my favorite game of the series because of how deftly it holds a mirror to me as an American and reflects not only the history I wasn't able to live, but also to my present America when it asks me, what are you going to do with your time now? The 2020s are turbulent years for the United States of America, and in many ways, the world. From the ongoing tumult of the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, undergone many years of political and societal instability that older Americans may find oddly familiar. In short, there is a war at home, a war of justice, of black and white, of the powerful and powerless, with weapons of voices, posters, and song wielded just as often as guns, tear gas, dogs, and police batons. As the United States grapples with both its legacies of deeply rooted political and economic white supremacy, I hope that we, you and I, also meet our people's societal desire to move forward into a new era of prosperity and harmony with other peoples of the world after decades of needless war, strife, and bloodshed. Thank you for being here, and thank you for watching my video.